Dr. Patrick Harris, representing the Public Health Association of Australia. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For agreeing to appear before us. Would you now please state your name and position title and swear either an oath or affirmation?
So I'm Dr. Patrick Harris. I'm a Senior Research Fellow from Sydney University, but I'm here representing the Public Health Association of Australia. And I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Would you like to make a short statement?
Yes, please. The Public Health Association of Australia is the leading national peak body for public health representation and advocacy to drive better health outcomes through evidence-informed policy. My role is Vice President, New South Wales branch of the PHAA, and I'm also a Senior Research Fellow at the Menzies Centre for Health Policy at the University of Sydney. My expertise is in the inclusion of public health issues in public policy rather than the technical evaluation of health impacts, but I'm happy to take technical questions on notice. We are concerned and sympathetic to the concerns of the public around the project's health impacts as it stands, but are focused here on planning decisions we would like to see addressed by the inquiry. As articulated in our submission to this inquiry, the known relationship between health impacts and transport planning crosses a range of issues including safety, environmental conditions such as air, water and soil, climate change, facilitators or barriers to physical activity, social connectedness, mental well-being, access to goods and services, and opportunities for employment. From a public health perspective, the preference is on a mix of transport modality options, including but not limited to roads. Our concern is that the WestConnex motorway project did not allow this. The planning for that, sorry. This is made more problematic by the early planning for the project never having been in the public domain. By the time the updated business case was produced in 2015, the key decisions preferencing the motorway project as the sole alternative have been made but are not available for scrutiny. There is a clear contradiction at the heart of the project. The updated business case refers to achieving the New South Wales Government strategic goal number 8, which is to improve public transport by reducing the number of vehicles on the road. This appears to be the opposite in WestConnex, which fundamentally provides a motorway to cater for a larger number of vehicles. There are no costing figures attached to the updated business case to alternative transport investments. The resulting analysis suggests that roads are the only viable option without testing that assumption. The emphasis is then on maximising attractiveness to road users in order to deliver a return on capital, not about meeting any proven transport need. The planning for the project is opaque and difficult to assess and understand. For instance, the details behind the original broad and multimodal solutions that Infrastructure New South Wales undertook in 2012 are missing. The original Infrastructure New South Wales State Infrastructure Strategy and a 35-page report about the idea of WestConnex argues that WestConnex must be more than a road. But the analysis presented in these documents suggests that additional concerns raised in community consultations that informed that planning, including coordination of land use and transport planning, improved public transport, improved urban amenity, minimising air and noise issues and protecting heritage, are consistently undervalued. The economic analysis presented in these documents emphasises the benefits of the projects, especially travel time savings, marginalising the required mix of risks and benefits that are known to impact on public health. Further, the wider economic analyses focuses on agglomeration and labour supply. This ignores the known evidence that transport infrastructure influences many different dimensions of health by shaping the environment in which we live, work, move and socialise. Looking to the future, there are questions concerning whether the planning for WestConnex has adequately taken into account Sydney's strategic planning context. For instance, if WestConnex is integrated into government strategic decision-making, why has there not been an update as to see how the project will link with a 30-minute concept being developed and progressed by the Greater Sydney Commission? And if a primary driver for the project was connecting Western Sydney with the airport, the building of the second airport in the west challenges this assumption and should warrant a review of that earlier analysis.
Thank you. We'll commence with the
Thank you.
opposition members.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Harris, for coming along this afternoon. And thank you for the submission from the organisation, which is submission 381 to this inquiry. Can I take you to that submission itself? And with respect to pages 5 and 6, in that you make comments in regard to your concerns or the organisation's concerns with respect to the business case, and that's been commented further in your opening statement. Are there any particular points within those two pages 5 and 6 that you'd like to add any additional detail to? Because if there is, I'd like to draw that out a little bit. If not, I can move on to some further questions which relate to your recommendations.
We're concerned that the business case process is not adequately addressing a broad range of public health concerns. So as I said in my opening remarks, we feel that the known evidence of the links between transport planning and public health is much broader than travel time savings or issues related to driving in vehicles. And we just think that at this point, what they call it, the benefit cost assessment should more adequately incorporate those concerns.
So if we're looking at a large project, a large infrastructure project, and if we say that what we want to do when we set out to look at this project is to take into account what is the current best practice or generally understood good standards that we want to adopt when it takes into account, or when it should take into account, public health impact matters. Where do we look to find out what those considerations are? Is there a list or a set of metrics, or could you please give us?
Yeah. So there's some very. There's been a lot of evidence around this since the 1990s around the relationship between the urban form and public health.
Yes.
More recently, there's been some work in a Lancet Commission series, which would identifies the causal pathways between urban transport planning decisions and all the way down to different risks, different air quality, noise, things about sedentary activity, all the way to hospitalisations. So that's a very sophisticated evidence base that we really don't feel is being adequately captured in the current processes.
So if I ask you to turn your mind to, you have an understanding or at least some familiarity with what are these best practice indices that are used in making these assessments, and cast your eyes now onto the WestConnex project, where do you identify the key gaps as being? Are there any standouts which are not being taken into account, which you believe really, are real missed opportunities? They should have been in there at the very least.
So these projects are, as you know, enormously complicated to plan. One of the main concerns we have up front is that the original decision to proceed with the project was based on really what's an opaque sort of set of what I would call potentially motherhood statements in, I think initially Infrastructure New South Wales came up with the idea of WestConnex based on the fact that 96% of the people were using cars, therefore let's build a road. Right. Okay, so that's the planning decision. Later on in the process, there are an enormous amount of points where you can have checks and balances around what you might consider, but the problem is that the decision for the road's been made up front, rather than comparing, roads versus alternate, modes of transport. So that's one problem. Within the process itself, things like air quality and noise assessments get done by the Department of Health and others fairly well in the impact assessment process. But as far as we know, that's very late on in the process. So that's around mitigation and around compliance and about project approvals. But at that point, it's almost like it's too late. The decision's been made. We're just trying to sort of retrofit the decision to what we think the impacts might be. However, having said that, one of the issues around WestConnex that we have looked at in terms of the environmental assessment is that the social issues weren't really fully considered, we feel.
And would you like to tell us what the term social issues would encompass as a consideration? So
things like mental well-being, things like social connectedness, what's happening in local communities around when these big projects come into people's lives. And it's more than, just a kind of NIMBY response. It's about what's happening when people don't fully understand what's happening in their lives and suddenly a decision is thrust upon them that, to be quite frank, is very challenging for them.
Dr. Harris, you have some familiarity with the environmental impact statement, the WestConnex environmental impact statement.
Yeah.
You've read it?
Yep.
Can you point to me the page in which it considers health effects?
Which of the 1,000 pages would you like me to point to? There's an air quality, there's a health impact assessment area in the document, and this is one of the EISs for one stage of the project we've mainly looked at in terms of the M4 East. And that's mainly considered around air quality issues.
And that's the extent of it, really?
Pretty much, which we feel is limited. Particularly concerns in the community were raised around air quality issues really being tied to the transport modelling data that was included in the first place. So.
And in the Secretary's approval conditions, would you describe any of the conditions that the Secretary improved when she gave planning approval, or he at the time, I'm not sure which one it was, did any of them establish any enforceable commitments from WestConnex in respect to health that would put your association at ease?
No.
And final question I've got before Mr. Donnelly might wish to continue is, will the WestConnex make me healthier?
No.
And can you tell me how will it make me unhealthier? And can you explain, if so, how?
Potentially. I don't want to get caught in the technicalities, as I said, so I can take that on notice and refer to some of my colleagues who are more expert in this area.
Well, I do appreciate you, Doctor, taking my personal health needs on notice to come back to me under oath. But you don't need to limit it to me per se. What I'm trying to say is that what are your concerns and fears about how this project could lead to adverse health outcomes for the communities affected that we should be aware of?
So I think at a large scale level, if you're not giving people you're not giving people adequate choice to have different transport options, you're sort of trapping them into cars for the next 100 years, which is not ideal from a public health perspective, either in terms of sedentary behaviour or issues around air quality, noise, etc. I think from a construction perspective, there are a lot of...
Before we move on from that, is that more likely to disproportionately affect people who live in Sydney's west than people who live closer to the Sydney's urban core?
Yep. Yes.
Doctor, at this stage of the project, the project is out there and concrete's probably being poured as we speak. Is it too late to look at some of these matters that you would argue should have been considered in the first instance? I mean, the die is set in some respects, but is it too late to argue that there are matters in particular, specific public health matters and potential impacts that we should be looking at and arguing for that?
Yes.
Could you please elucidate?
So the challenge here from a public health perspective is, as I was saying before, is the strategic decision-making that went ahead to inform that a road would be built at, whatever is it, $18 billion cost to the taxpayer. From a public health perspective, you'd like to see that there were, what would be the decisions that if that cost was spread across the network, the existing network, even smaller investments, what would be the benefit of that? But we can't see that because that's not clear in any of the analysis that's presented in those early planning documents. And by the time you get to the EIS process, as I was saying, which is usually where the health input happens, and usually is done to the best, to quite high technical skill and rigour, it's too late almost.
Thanks, Dr. Harris.
Yep.
Thanks for appearing before the committee, Dr. Harris. Just going back to your submission now, particularly in relation to obviously measuring the health impacts within a cost-benefit analysis. And you say here on page 5 that there are legislated requirements to consider a wide range of impacts and that they weren't sufficiently met, I think specifically in relation to the cost-benefit analysis. Would you be able to point the committee in the direction of what those legislative requirements are?
Sorry, could you just which
So
paragraph
it's
is
page
that?
5.
Yep.
We're talking the third or fourth. It starts with the PHAA on page 5.
Okay.
And it says there's legislative requirements. It's got a footnote to an academic article, but that's okay. Possibly take that on notice if you're...
Yeah, sorry, let me just read this for a
Okay.
second, thanks. Yeah, I think I'll take that on notice, thanks.
Okay, no worries. That would be very useful, I think. As a doctor, I'm particularly interested, I don't know if you were here for the last session of residents, some of whom are from Rozelle, talking about the potential impacts of stacks, particularly. We had one gentleman saying that he had would have a stack within 100 metres of his house and another 3 within 1 kilometre of where he was, and in that area there's schools and obviously lots of residents and what have you, and he also unfortunately had bladder cancer, which he spoke to the committee personally about. As a doctor, do you have concerns about for stacks in residential areas? And are you aware of the fact that in Australia or in New South Wales, we don't filter our ventilation stacks from motorways, and does that concern you?
So unfortunately, I'm not a medical doctor.
Oh, business doctor.
I know, that's right.
Now he doesn't want your advice.
I'm the original type of doctor which has a PhD, Doctor of Philosophy. And no, I can't answer that because I don't have the expertise, but I can take that on notice.
Okay, all right, no worries.
Free medical advice.
So back to the cost-benefit analysis then, which is largely what the Public Health Association submission was dealing with. So what would you consider then would be, so you talk about the need to undertake to consider a wide range of impacts in the CBA. So what would you prefer to have seen the government or whoever the agency was that the consultant who did the cost-benefit analysis, what would you prefer that they should have done to measure all of the costs of this motorway?
The challenge with cost-benefit as it's currently practiced in New South Wales is that particularly for transport projects, is that there's a real emphasis on travel time savings. And that is because that can be, costed fairly efficiently, I suspect. What we are concerned about as an association is the whole range of impacts that we've articulated in our submission. Whether or not cost-benefit analysis is ultimately the right tool to include those things should be questioned. However, and I can take this on notice to get more detail, but my understanding from health economists is that cost-benefit analysis doesn't necessarily have to be as narrowly applied as it is. And it can incorporate a much wider range of impacts, which is really, as we've listed at the front of our submission, the range of things we think should be considered. And I should say as well, going back to the previous member's inquiry about equity, these type of impacts are differentially distributed across the population. In this case, particularly disadvantaging the west of Sydney, maybe, and also locally impacted communities, and those should be considered better as well.
Yes, that was actually going to be one of my next questions. Do I have time for one more? It's just probably something that he will take on notice anyway, actually, because it's a request for some possibly better practice, or world's best practice, if you like, cost-benefit analysis of similar transport projects that have taken into account the cost to health in terms of public health impacts.
So I will take that on notice, but at the same time, as I'm a researcher and I am investigating that line of inquiry myself, and I think there is a real benefit if that kind of research was to happen to understand best practice internationally.
Thank you.
Thank you again for being a witness at our hearing. I just noted in your comments on the business case, you've made a very strong case that the government is really only interested in the economic factors. I can't find anywhere much or any reference to health factors, as you've indicated. The 2015 updated business case, particularly the economic appraisal chapter and so on, and the quote you have, which the government's taken as approval for them, the economic analysis undertaken demonstrates that WestConnex is economically viable, etc. With economic benefits. So the government's focus is on the economic benefits, and there's no reference, it seems to be, to health benefits. Would you like to comment on that?
I agree. One of the challenges for government in sort of looking forward to these types of projects is how wide do we go around how we define the economy? And currently the economy is usually around, particularly for large infrastructure projects, is on the cost of the asset. But the asset has much wider impacts, and they should be factored into the decision making.
So you would be arguing that there should be stronger public health considerations by the government in considering it?
I would argue there should be stronger public interest considerations, of which public health would be one.
So would you call that a blind spot in the government's thinking?
Depends how large the blind spot is. The blind spot on the sun. Yes, it's a blind spot.
And would that be caused partly by the philosophy of a Liberal National Party government?
I don't believe so, no. I think one of the things I would like to say is I think the investment in infrastructure here in New South Wales has been unprecedented under the recent government, and that's, brings with it risks and it brings with it benefits for the population. I think going forward, what we'd like to see is a much more transparent assessment process and cost-benefit analysis, but an appraisal process to inform these decisions. I'm not saying that infrastructure is terrible at all. It's got great benefits, but it's just they're not captured in the current methodologies that are used to plan for these projects.
In your submission, you make reference to inequitable distribution of impacts, quote, in your recommendations. Could you expand what you mean by that, and how do you come to this criticism, and what criteria do you use?
So, from a public health perspective, we know that that health status in the population is what we would call differentially distributed. So those who are, I think from an urban planning or a transport planning perspective, those that might be geographically disadvantaged by a decision are likely to have worse health outcomes. So something like WestConnex is interesting because it's sold on the idea of bringing the West to the centre of the city almost. But one of our concerns is that it doesn't actually address the sort of urban livability problems that are happening in the West. And also, unfortunately, the people from the West are looking like they're going to have to pay for it as well on the tolls. So that, therefore, immediately disadvantages those people. I should say as well, actually, that locally, one of the challenges here is that there's often a trade-off with regional impacts and local impacts on local communities. I think it would be interesting to see or to think earlier on about how local communities are, quite diverse and they're not necessarily homogenous as entities. And I do believe that kind of detail is missing from some of the planning behind this too.
Thank you. We'll move on to the government representatives.
Thanks very much. Thanks for coming in, Dr. Harris.
Thank you.
Also a non-doctor doctor.
Oh, good.
Thanks.
I wouldn't get medical advice from you, I felt.
Dr. Harris, would you say that healthy planning really hit its stride during a major legislative reform exercise that began in 2011?
I would, and if you look at some of my own work, that would be starting from work that we did what happened in New South Wales from about 10 years prior to that. So yes, that was a window of opportunity to influence.
And that it came to a head in November 2017 when the State Parliament passed amendments to the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act?
It didn't come to a head, no. Still going.
Oh, okay. I've just got an article here in the Conversation from a Dr. Patrick Harris, which states, and I quote, "This came to a head in November 2017 when the State Parliament passed amendments to the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act 1979. Is that a different Dr. Harris?
It's the same Dr. Harris, but I think you're misquoting the piece.
Healthy planning has New South Wales brought health into planning? Healthy planning has always had champions in New South Wales, but rarely hit its stride during a major legislative reform exercise that began in 2011. This came to a head in November 2017.
The exercise came into a head
when the State Parliament passed amendments to the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act 1979. This legislation now lists two objects of direct importance to health: protection of the health and safety of occupants of buildings, promotion of good design and amenity of the built environment. Did you write that?
I do, but if you understand public policies, I'm sure you do, Doctor, public policy does not stop at legislation. So legislative reform can come to a conclusion when that legislation has been amended, but the system itself has to then respond to that legislation.
What aspect of the current WestConnex project do you believe does not meet the requirements of the EPA Act?
EPA or EPAB?
The EPA Act. Environmental Planning and Assessments Act 1979.
None of it meets the amendment because the amendments only happened at the beginning of this year. So the project was planned way before the amendments came into force.
So you're saying there was no health consideration done?
Of course there was health consideration done. I've talked about that already. There was health consideration around air quality and noise, but that's not legislated. The health side of that is not in the legislation, or was not at that time.
That's true, it wasn't in that time, but if it was under consideration during the process of the creation of the project, surely that would be of benefit to the project's assessment.
It would.
Yes, and it was done, was it not?
The air quality side of the environmental impact statement was done.
Not in the cost-benefit analysis.
But not in the cost-benefit analysis, that's right.
Planning conditions imposed.
Did you also write that shifting infrastructure funding to benefit the cities west will be the core fault line for delivering on promises of equitable infrastructure provision? Given that the travel times related to the new WestConnex project will be sharply shortened for travel from Western Sydney to the city, isn't that exactly the sort of equitable benefit that you're looking for?
The challenge for that kind of thinking is that, and I've said this in my opening remarks, I think it's a more equitable benefit would be shifting to a city that's a 30-minute city that benefited the west as much as it does the east.
Okay.
And that's what's apparently happening.
Do you know how much the government is spending on public transport over the next 4 years?
No, I tried to find this information, prior to coming, so I can take that on notice.
That's okay. I can tell you it's 51.2 billion over the forward estimates, including a new metro system of 20 billion, an intercity fleet of 2.8 billion, and trains specifically for growth areas of Sydney at 1.5 billion. Does that sound like a comprehensive transport solution?
It sounds more comprehensive than was in the original Infrastructure New South Wales document and the updated business case, which doesn't give any of those figures.
You suggest in your submission that WestConnex has failed to adequately consider the range of health impacts that such a massive road project brings. Are you aware that the government will not approve the motorway tunnel project until the New South Wales Chief Health Officer releases a statement on the potential health impact of the project?
I'll take that on notice.
Okay. That does me. That's it.
I might just...
Mr. Mallon?
Thank you, Mr Chair. Thank you, Dr Harris. And we're not at odds here. I agree that health impacts and benefits should be brought into all assessment of government activity. And I think that Dr Phelps is reflecting that change has been embedded in reforms. Excuse me. But, if you're talking about, you dismissed the focus on economic benefits in the business case when in your conversation or your evidence to Reverend Nile. Surely, if there's a strong, flourishing, robust, growing economy with higher employment, ideally increased real wages, people going about their lives in productive employment, that has a population health benefit as well.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
So that is a legitimate health objective as well. It can't be dismissed as being nothing to do with health.
So I think that the language of dismissal is probably a bit strong, and I do apologise if I came across that way. I think what I said was it would be nice to sort of broaden out what we mean by the economy as opposed to it being just financial.
That's what you actually did say.
Yeah, thanks.
You didn't say dismissal.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Thank
your
you.
But my point,
Thank
the point about the difference between financial impacts and economic impacts should be noted.
Well, I didn't. I may imply you said it. I was suggesting you were
No,
dismissing
you
it.
did say you said it. You said dismissed.
Thank you.
Yeah, don't debate with other witnesses,
I'll
with
save
other
that up
members
for
of the
later.
committee.
We heard from, and you probably didn't see the testimony, I'm not sure. We heard from, I think it was Treasury, but one of the witnesses, the government witnesses earlier today, informed us that part of the economic benefit of the WestConnex business case is actually the reduction in road trauma and the reduction in fatalities. They've taken notice to give us that information. So that's, and that's the first time I'd considered that, that actually going to reduce the fatalities on the roads, on the service roads. So that's clear health benefit of WestConnex that you'd want to consider. Well, you might laugh in the audience, but I think reducing fatalities is a legitimate objective.
No, for sure. I mean, both these things that you've just mentioned are part of the sort of the range of health impacts you'd like to see, or the range that we call them indirect impacts that you'd like to see considered, and they are considered fairly well. Transport planning guidance federally focuses on injury very well. But what we're concerned about is that the full range of impacts aren't considered. So the focus tends to default to a financial basis for the asset, and then if it does broaden out, it might stop at air quality and it might stop at injury, but there are also other issues around social equity, social inclusion, access to goods and services, etc., which we think should be considered as well.
But just following up on that, surely time spent with one's family is positive for one's mental state and as a positive mental health outcome. yes?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so if you can transit from home to the city and city to home, saving even half an hour a day, that half an hour a day spent with your family is surely a better mental health outcome for you than being stuck in traffic on Parramatta Road.
So that's not the question. The question is, was that considered in the cost-benefit analysis of WestConnex?
Well, it's certainly been in public statements from the Minister.
Right, but that, again, was it in the cost-benefit analysis? I mean, that's the question for us. We'd like to see that in there. I mean, again, I'm not saying that these projects are ultimately terrible for human health. What we'd like to see is that they had a balanced, assessment of the impacts within them.
That's fair enough.
Well, I certainly put it to, and I think Dr. Phelps was on the same subject, is that you looked at looking at WestConnex in isolation, but the government. I'm pretty proud of the public transport commitment the government's given, because I'm a big advocate of public transport. The government's broader infrastructure investment, put aside the massive amounts going into hospitals and so forth, is a big slice of public transport. Probably the first time in 30 years that there's been such a huge investment in public transport. So in context, it's a more balanced approach to transport and health.
Yeah, so what challenges me is coming to prepare for this today. I looked through the updated business case, and I looked through the Infrastructure New South Wales documents, and those figures aren't there. So I would be much happier that balance was being achieved, or it would inform me if I was having to make a decision about the project, if those figures were there. At the moment, there's just sort of a box of, we're investing in these different projects, but it's not costed. So it would be useful to have that information
You
there.
have to plough through the budget papers and come to estimates.
Well, exactly, but I mean, from a sort of a community point of view, is how can they make an informed judgment when that information's not there?
That's a fair point. That's a fair
We
point.
appreciate you coming in, and we could keep discussing this now for a while, but we have other witnesses that we have to hear.
Questions I noticed though.
But I was just looking at the diagram that the government has provided about the WestConnex, and of course the big omission is the second airport, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you very much.
And if there are any questions on those, I think we had some. You have 21 days to answer, and you'll be given those questions by the Secretariat. So
Great.
you don't have to work on your memory. We'll give you the questions, and
Oh,
then
that's
you'll
very
have
useful.
21
Thank you
days
very much.
from the time you receive the questions.
Okay. Thank you for
So
your time.
thank you again for your help and the research you've been doing on this issue. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr.
Now, next series of witnesses. Could each witness, starting from my left, please state their name, position, title, and swear either an oath or affirmation, and the words are on the cards in front of you.
Dr. John Warburton, Inner West Council Deputy General Manager of Community and Engagement. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Darcy Byrne, Mayor of the Inner West. I solemnly and sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Kendall Banfield, Manager WestConnex Unit, Inner West Council. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Sam Shaw, Strathfield Council. I solemnly, Environmental Projects Officer, sorry. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Do any of the witnesses wish to make a short opening statement?
Yes, please, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
I would like to begin by thanking the committee members for the opportunity to address you at today's inquiry. I'm here to represent the Inner West Council's position in relation to this project. Inner West Council has continued the democratically determined position of the former constituent councils of Ashfield, Leichhardt and Marrickville in opposition to this project, and we do so on public policy grounds. In our view, the project has been wasteful and shambolically planned. We don't stand opposed, as I know some do, including some who will give evidence at this inquiry, to expenditure or investment in roads. What we do oppose is ideological obsession with investment in roads at the expense of public transport solutions as well. We believe that the money that has been invested in WestConnex and the adjunct projects such as the Second Harbour Tunnel should have been better spent on 21st century solutions to congestion, modern public transport. In particular, it has been the adopted position of all of our councils and the Inner West Council that the Western Metro should have been prioritised over this motorway. There's a number of points that I'd like to make about the process that has occurred. And this goes back some time. I've been involved in this issue for a very long period of time, since December 2013, when as Mayor of Leichhardt, I moved a mayoral minute to have our council actively campaign against the project. We had spent about 12 months prior to that trying to get information from the government about the justification for it and how it would improve congestion, without any success. We all know that there has been a great deal of difficulty in getting information about the business case or the economic justification for the project publicly released or scrutinised. There's been little consideration of alternative transport options, no consideration or very little consideration of community impact in relation to health and amenity impacts in our community in the inner west of Sydney, and no consideration of the equity of the impact of tolls. We've been working to protect our community from WestConnex. We believe that the consultation that has been undertaken throughout the project has been tokenistic, and the compensation that has been received by our community as a whole has been negligible. I acknowledge that some residents who've had their homes acquired have received fair compensation, but we all know that there are many who have not and have had great difficulty. There are multiple examples that I could list about the negative impacts of the project in terms of the amenity of residents in the inner west of Sydney. I won't give you a laundry list of those now, but obviously shocking impacts on residents have included air pollution during the construction phase, noise, vibration, dust, smell, and the impact of employee parking, all of which has been poorly planned. Health issues which are ongoing, including prolonged night works. And I wouldn't invite any committee member who thinks that those impacts have been acceptable to have me or someone from the Inner West community come round to their house at 3 o'clock in the morning with a jackhammer and see whether you think that is morally acceptable. The impact of trucks, and we know that that is the cumulative impact of that in White Bay and Rozelle is going to be much worse during the next phase of the project. Operational traffic, compulsory acquisitions, dilapidation of buildings, and the loss of green space. And I might add that we have had several successes in fighting back against parks that had been identified for compulsory acquisition. And I think, obviously, in most of those instances, they were solutions that had been identified by an engineer rather than someone who was actually looking out for community interest. I do think that the planning of this project, regardless of your view about the merits, has been shambolic and unprofessional. The fact that even now there is not certainty about exactly where the tunnel will come out in Rozelle and how the interchange there will work 5 years after the project was first announced is symptomatic of the poor planning that has occurred throughout the process. There's no respite for our community in sight. The proposed second Western Harbour Tunnel, and I know some members of the committee might suggest that this is separate and not relevant to the terms of the inquiry, but that's siloed thinking. That would be symptomatic of the problems that have occurred throughout the project, where we've got one team of people saying that the second or the third stage of the project is not relevant to them. The fact is, we said all the way along that if you create this hugely increased flow of traffic to the Anzac Bridge with no increased capacity on the bridge, it will be a tunnel to a traffic jam. And so it's not surprising that the solution now is another $14 billion expenditure on the second Harbour Tunnel and Northern Beaches Tunnel. That does involve the acquisition of the Balmain Tigers Leagues Club site, the creation of the equivalent of a small mine in the middle of Rozelle Shopping Centre, and it will kill off the Balmain Tigers. They've been fighting for a long time to return to their home in Rozelle. Acquisition of that site will result in the loss of one of Australia's oldest sporting institutions. I am particularly concerned about the impact in the next stage of the amenity and health impacts on Rozelle Public School. I'll remind committee members that the Minister for Education and the former Minister for Planning told the Manly Daily, and I quote, "I won't be party to putting smokestacks near kids. There's no way in hell that I'd support any development that would put the lives of pupils, teachers and parents at risk." Well, I respect Mr Stokes and consider him to be a reasonable man. If there's no way in hell that he would allow a smokestack near a school in his electorate, then there's no way on earth that we should allow a small open-cut mine and a smokestack directly adjacent to Rozelle Public School. And the parents of our local community, it's not just Rozelle, but Haberfield Public School, St Peter's Public School, all of the schools that have been impacted consider that to be incredibly hypocritical. We know that the cumulative impacts of the major state projects in the Inner West are going to be significant, and in White Bay and Rozelle, in relation to the next stage, we know that the cumulative impact of WestConnex Stage 3, the construction of the Harbour Tunnel, the Sydney Metro, the concrete batching plant and multi-user facility will create a cumulative impact of more than 4,000 additional truck movements each day. I don't see how traffic is going to function on the City West Link leading onto Anzac Bridge during that construction phase. That concludes the opening statement that I wish to make on behalf of the Council. I do want to make one personal comment in relation to the project. I note that on election night 2015, the now member for Newtown said, and I quote, "What this win in Newtown means tonight is that there will be no WestConnex." And she said further at another time, "There is no way WestConnex is coming anywhere near here." The current member for Balmain is busily getting around the community. Well, excellent. I'll ask you to address the question. The current member for Balmain is busy getting around the community claiming that there's a simple solution to stopping WestConnex, which is the cancellation of contracts. I would encourage members of this committee to pose the question to the political party that they represent and to those members about why Jenny Leong hasn't stopped WestConnex, given that was her election commitment, and why and how Mr Parker, the member for Balmain, is intending to fund the compensation package that would be involved in the cancellation of the project. Presumably that would involve cutting funding from hospitals, schools and public transport projects, and I think that should be a matter of public record as well. I'll leave it there.
Good. We'll commence with
Chair.
Kate Fearman from the Greens.
You were going quite well there for a minute, Councillor Byrne, until Mayor Byrne, until your last statement does
Your
say
worship is the
Councillor Byrne.
technical title, but no one uses it.
So, Councillor Byrne,
Well, he's made an opening
are
statement.
you a member of any political party?
You're well aware that I am.
Could you just, for the record, for Hansard, so we can get it on the record, which political party is that?
The Australian Labor Party.
And you sound like you are completely personally opposed to the project.
I've done more to oppose the project than you have.
So you were in the office of Infrastructure Minister Anthony Albanese, I understand, back in, was it 2012, 2013?
I'm here in my capacity as the Mayor of the Inner West, and I'm happy to answer questions in that regard. I don't speak for Mr Albanese in relation to the project.
Well, do you think it was a mistake in your capacity as Mayor of the Inner West, as Labor Mayor of the Inner West, for then Infrastructure Minister Anthony Albanese to commit $1.8 billion to WestConnex?
Interesting question, and I'll answer it in depth. It's important to acknowledge that there was more money invested from the federal government, from the Commonwealth, in urban public transport between 2007 and 2013 than there was in the entirety of our federation combined before then. I'm just addressing the question.
This is just about WestConnex.
I know. Well, you're asking a question completely unrelated to my evidence, and I'm answering it.
No, I'm not.
So I think that was an...
Witness is free to answer the question.
Thank you for that. So I think that's important to acknowledge. More investment in urban public transport from the Labor government in those 6 years than had occurred in the 100 years before. In 2011 or 2012, you probably know better than me, you appear to have notes before you, the proposition that was put by the federal government at the time was that if the New South Wales government wanted to come up with a project that would address two problems, freight getting to and from Port Botany and commuters getting to and from the CBD, that the federal government would work with them on the planning study for that. The fact is that the project that we now have before us has morphed repeatedly and now meets neither of those objectives. If you would like to call Mr Albanese as a witness to this inquiry, I suggest you do so, and he can explain exactly why he has objected so strenuously to the project. I know that he has raised it his objections to the project in the federal parliament more than 50 times.
Do you think, though, that $1.8 billion that was committed to WestConnex was done so a little bit before due diligence was undertaken and possibly shouldn't have been from federal Labor?
I think you're mischaracterising the nature of the commitment that was made by the federal government at the time.
I don't think you'd seen a business case. Is that correct?
I think you're mischaracterising the nature of the commitment that was made at the time.
Okay, I'll move on to just a question to Mr. Banfield. Thanks very much for a very detailed submission. The Inner West Council submission is excellent. You mentioned instances where notification procedures for significant noise 3 to 4 nights a week were not received. There's all this detail about, you know, the experiences of Inner West Council residents. And I think you talk about compliance. So obviously the council's frustrated because you don't have the ability to advocate for more compliance powers. So what powers, in your opinion, could be given to council when there's not compliance around these construction noises that residents are experiencing?
Yeah, look, the issue of council having statutory compliance powers was raised early on in the project. But as it stands, council has no statutory powers. We can only play a communication role. We're often a third party mediating between residents and state agencies. And as you know, the Department of Planning has a key role, and EPA as well. So yes, as it stands, we have no statutory powers, so it's only advocacy. But the question has been raised as to precisely what kind of role council could have if it was stepped up to a statutory role. That's never really been investigated.
Is it frustrating for council then in terms of having all of these residents complaining to you? And we're hearing that on this end, the light rail inquiry, in fact, that a lot of the complaints don't seem to be dealt with in the manner that residents wish them to be. Is it frustrating for council to be on the other end of these complaints?
Yeah,
Have the powers to
most definitely,
deal with them.
It can be, yes. And we do have to be upfront with residents and say we are just a stakeholder like everyone else, but we do our best to help residents. And we do have compliance officers from the Department of Planning sit with us in the council office for some of the time each week. So we do have a good relationship with them. But ultimately, yeah, we're just a stakeholder. But we do our best to help residents where we can. Thank you.
Just wanted to, I know we always have limited time, so just a question in relation to Strathfield Council, if I can. So I've got some questions in relation to unfiltered stacks and conditions around those. I asked a question this morning of RMS that within the approvals, there should be development controls around stacks. Are you familiar with this? And they should be providing you with assistance there to the council?
I'm a little familiar with that, yes. It does seem that we have been given not enough assistance in terms of planning and development controls at present. So we would certainly like to see more assistance from state government around development controls.
Because it does say specifically within the approval that the proponent must assist the relevant councils, which in this instance Strathfield, in developing an air quality assessment process for inclusion in a development control plan or other appropriate planning instruments. You're saying that RMS has not approached Strathfield Council to offer that assistance. They should also pay for anything in relation to that.
As far as I'm aware, at present, no, they have not.
Okay, so in the meantime, though, I understand that there are quite a few high-rise buildings around the stack. Is that correct? Would you like to talk about those concerns?
Yes, that is correct. Strathfield Council's perspective on the matter is that we are not against WestConnex per se, but we do have issues with the ventilation stack plan for Underwood Road and the emissions and the impacts of emissions on surrounding residents. Particularly with buildings, like you mentioned, that are planned at height up to 80 metres, and some of those buildings would be 30 to 40 metres from the surrounding stack. So certainly that's our primary issue.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. We'll move on to the...
Thank you, Your Worship. And the other
became the first person to use that title.
Indeed.
I think it's comrade.
That's for more for Labor Party committees.
I'm not sure Darcy's on Daniel's pre-selection.
Mr. Mayor, Mr. Mayor, I hope not. Mr. Mayor, you say the Inner West Council has lost green space. How much?
Well, that's still up for debate. We still don't know even now.
So hang on, how many years into construction are we? We've been under construction now. This project has been underway since 2014. You're telling me that you do not know how much green space is still at risk in the Inner West.
That's true.
And you say that the RMS thought about using compulsory acquisition for parks. Are you able to either now or on notice tell us which ones?
Yeah, I'll run you through some of them, and then on notice I'll make sure that you get a thorough list. Just working through the LGA, at the beginning of the project they talked about acquiring Ashfield Park. A community campaign was launched to prevent that. And the government did listen, thanks in part to some advocates both within and outside of the government. Following on from that, there's been the loss of other green space adjacent to in Reg Cody Reserve in Haberfield, going into Leichhardt at different times. Parks that have been targeted for acquisition have included Blackmore Oval, one of the oldest sporting fields in the Inner West, which is heavily used by both rugby league and cricket clubs. The Oval at Leichhardt campus within Sydney Secondary College, which is a very overcrowded public high school with very little green open space. Some genius came up with the idea that they'd take the Oval as a dive site for the construction of WestConnex. They had targeted at one point King George Oval in Rozelle, which is adjacent to Callum Park, very precious, highly used recreational space on the Bay Run. At different times, we have had suggestions of parks within Birchgrove and Balmain being taken. Camdenville Park is being used as a construction site right now. In St Peters, we're having ongoing disputes with the government about whether we will get back all of the green space and facilities that were promised to us at the conclusion of the project.
At the same time, in the Inner West, is it correct to say that the density, the urban density, the population increase in the urban West has increased at the same time the amount of urban green space has declined? Is that correct?
Absolutely. And because most kids in the Inner West don't have sizable backyards, protection and enhancement of the existing parks and open spaces that we do have is a priority for the council and for the community, and that's why there's been such vociferous opposition from local residents and the council each time one of these precious parks has been targeted.
And so to the extent to which property has been acquired which is surplus to WestConnex need, the Desan site, a variety of these different sites, do you think there's an opportunity here to increase urban green space, or is it the case that the government is far more interested in turning it over to developers?
Well, that's our concern, is that it will be used for development or that it will be handed back to us as a barren concrete slab, which would then have a very large price tag for us to convert that into a usable park. And to be honest, we haven't really had any trustworthy commitments in writing, any statutory commitments from the government as yet about what condition we'll get that land back in.
Have you had the opportunity to have dialogue with the government about these concerns?
Not really. I feel like there's been a tone of disregard and disrespect towards the Inner West community.
Have you figured out which minister you should be talking to?
Well, it's impossible to know. They change so frequently, and that's not just ministers, it's also senior bureaucrats within each of the delivery authorities. You get a verbal commitment from one of them that they'll help you to address the loss of a park or that they're going to progress an issue for you, and then you go back 6 months later and they're no longer working there. So there's been a complete failure of communication with us as the local government.
So just before I turn over to my colleague, Mr Donnelly, to you, Mr Mayor, or to Mr Banfield, you say that you're the manager of the WestConnex unit at the Inner West team. Can you describe just how much resources the Inner West Council, at ratepayers' expense, by the way, which I am one of them, has allocated to be able to deal with this whole project? What is the nature of the commitment the council has made? That's the first aspect of it. And secondly, has any of this cost been recovered by RMS or from the Sydney Motorway Corporation or any of them, or is it simply the case that the ratepayers are having to actually pick up the tab for this?
Yeah, in our submission, to date, we've spent around just over $2 million on salaries for the WestConnex unit, which is myself and two colleagues. The council
returned to democratic control?
No, this is the WestConnex unit was actually created by the administrator. And in that figure is also a calculation we did about expenditure in terms of staff time from the former councils. So that comes to just over $2 million. But that's well and truly an underestimate. It also includes other expenses such as notices for community meetings, for example. But that's definitely an underestimate because there are a raft of other staff who are dealing with WestConnex amongst their other duties.
And sorry, the last aspect of that question was, have you had the opportunity to recover any of these costs against the project, or is it that you've picked up the tab?
No, we haven't.
If I might add, just if I can, also that we have recently sent a submission to the government. We've sent a document to the government, included in our subsequent submissions, about the road treatments that we think will be necessary to ameliorate the impacts once stage 1 opens.
That you have to pay for?
At the moment, yes. We haven't received, I think it's $30 million.
So you think the Inner West Council is going to have to pay $30 million to effectively undertake the Inner West integration works with the WestConnex? That's correct?
We've planned it very carefully. We know that it will be at or above that figure, and we've received no response from the government as yet about their willingness to contribute to the cost.
Mr Mayor, opposite my house is a street which I'd really like you to put some parking lines onto, by the way, but would really make my life, Your Worship. But are you saying that as a result of you having to budget for that $30 million, that projects like that have to be put aside or otherwise put on hold, or you can't make investment decisions about them because you have no idea whether or not the council's going to have to pick up the tab to pay for these integration works?
For certain. If our ratepayers have to foot the bill for the entirety of those $30 million in works, it will have an astronomical impact on our roads and footpaths maintenance budget.
Also, will you put the parking in that street up to my house?
If you send me an email.
Okay.
Mayor Byrne, thank you for the detailed submission.
Mr Donnelly?
Thank you, Mr Chair. On pages 20 through 24, there's detailed comment about concerns with respect to the air quality associated with this project in its development and its operational phase. I'm wondering, would you like to elucidate any particular points that you've made here and flesh them out a bit further?
Well, I think the crux of the issue is that our community members are well aware of the comments made by Premier Berejiklian in the past in the Parliament about how unsafe, unfiltered smokestacks can be. They're familiar with the comments which I attributed a moment ago to Minister Stokes about how dangerous unfiltered stacks can be for school children. And we really don't understand why, when two very senior members of the government have come to that unambiguous conclusion, they're willing to subject community members in the Inner West to the very same impacts without any concern.
How do you square, if you can square, what you've just said with evidence we received from government representatives this morning, that what is being proposed with respect to the stacks and how they operate is world's best practice? Essentially, the language was used that this is world's best practice that we're actually going to have. What's your response to that?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. Firstly, I accept that there is, we've received the same expert scientific advice that in fact the installation of stacks can reduce the harmful impact of air pollution. I understand that there is, scientific evidence to that effect, but the difference between putting that in a submission or the government asserting that here in this committee meeting and actually going out onto the street and explaining to people who are going to have an unfiltered stack next to their home that it's safe and there's nothing to worry about is very wide. And especially when the Premier herself and Minister Stokes have both been explicit about the fact that they don't believe that unfiltered stacks are safe and that they wouldn't put up with them in their own electorates and their own local communities. There's another important factor to consider, which is our argument all along has been that by focusing so heavily on investment in motorways that you are inducing additional private vehicle traffic, and that over time that has itself a detrimental impact on air quality. Now, I don't claim to be a scientific expert, but I just believe that we should have the same respectful treatment for our local community that the Premier and the Education Minister insist on having for theirs.
Have there been utterances from the two senior people in government about trying to reconcile a position that they've put publicly in the public domain in the Parliament and what's happening to the people in your area of responsibility? How do you square the two?
Well, no senior minister in the government bothers to come to the inner west of Sydney very much. I invited Minister Constant several times whilst he was planning to privatise our buses to come and debate me on the bus, and he never turned up.
Careful what you wish for.
I have not had any correspondence directly from Minister Stokes or from the Premier explaining how they can match up those two incongruous things. And I do think this goes to the general tone of disregard and disrespect that our community has been treated with throughout this project.
On page, and I'm sorry, my time is running out, on pages 35 through 37, you make some quite salient points about the impact of the project on land and property values and prices. You, in your opening statement, made some comments about differential treatments with respect to compensation. Are there any points you'd like to add to what you said in your opening statement?
The approach to notification of residents about compulsory acquisition was atrocious. There are numerous examples of people from non-English speaking backgrounds receiving nothing other than a leaflet under the door in English, notifying them that their home was likely to be targeted for acquisition. So to go to an Italian pensioner in Haberfield and notify them in that way without having a conversation with them when they don't have any access to independent legal representation or don't even know that they need to go and acquire that, results in inequitable and unfair outcomes. I acknowledge that some people have got just and fair compensation. 3%. But the fact that the government's own investigation into the compulsory acquisition system was kept secret and hidden for the first 2 years in which compulsory acquisitions were undertaken has not given us a lot of confidence that they were intent on treating people in a fair manner.
Thank you.
I'll just raise some questions too. Thank you very much for appearing before our inquiry. The government's made a lot of assertions about the future success of WestConnex, and I'd like to get your response to some of their claims. The first one, and you made this at the very beginning of your evidence, should there be some statutory powers for local councils to be involved with such projects like the WestConnex, that you're simply spectators on the fringe, not just your council but other councils? Does that seem to undermine the third tier of government in our state?
Look, I'm speaking off the top of my head here, but my preference would be for there to be proper regulation at the state level that strictly prohibited utility companies or any other agency from undertaking nighttime works or early morning works, as is still occurring in both Haberfield and St Peters and is having a terrible impact on the health and well-being of people with small children, students attempting to undertake their HSC or university study, and older people in particular. Essentially the reason that the administrator established the WestConnex unit was because the council was being inundated with complaints from residents about the fact that their complaints to the government were not being responded to. So I think the best mechanism would be for there to be stronger protections at the state level, which simply prohibited the sorts of activity that has been taking place. There has also been a range of problems with contractors employed on the contract breaching the conditions of consent of the project. The EPA is the regulatory authority in relation to most of those, and it's been very difficult for council and for the officers of the council, the public servants within the WestConnex unit and other sections of council, to try to uphold the public interest and advocate for residents when there's been such a the response has been so lacking from various state agencies.
Well, that's why I was phrasing the question that I raised with you at the beginning. Should the local councils have some statutory role in a major project like WestConnex.
Let me put it another
We're
way.
not spectators.
Yeah, we would much prefer that we had increased statutory powers to regulate the construction phase of the project than the status quo, which is resulting in really difficult and unacceptable impacts on local residents in our community.
The government's made a number of claims, one which you probably would find ironical, returning local streets to local communities.
We've analysed this very carefully, and according to the independent assessment that we have invested in, there's going to be a range of very serious traffic impacts on local streets when at the opening of each stage of the project. In my view, at the opening of stage 1, we're going to see the mother of all rat runs through the inner west of Sydney while people are coming out at Haberfield and trying to find their way to the CBD or to Port Botany or the airport without there being any mechanism for them to do so. And I think that will greatly increase the amount of commuter traffic on local streets, which will have amenity impacts but also pose serious safety problems.
That's similar to what's happening on Parramatta Road right now? Is that what you're worried about?
Yes.
Is it toll related?
It's certainly anecdotally, and from the evidence that I've seen reported in the public domain, it has been worsened by the imposition of the new toll on the M4.
In your evidence, you've already expressed concern about preserving open space and green space and so on. The government has claimed that 18 hectares of open space will be returned to local communities. 18 hectares of open space. Do you see any evidence for that?
Well, I'll believe it when I see it. Because the government's approach to the project and their interactions with us have been marked by a lack of transparency verging on dishonesty, my experience so far is that they identify a green space before we know about it, that they're planning to target for acquisition. It leaks into the public domain. They deny that any decision has been made, and then several months later they announce it as a fait accompli. In relation to the Rozelle interchange, the government's made some very grandiose commitments, mostly reflected in the colourful glossy pamphlet that they've distributed, about creating a new very sizable park there. But as I stated previously in one of my earlier responses, our concern is that what will be handed back to us at the completion of the project is just a concrete slab, and there's nothing on the table yet from the government that is actually a commitment that we can hold them to in regards to what residual land will be returned to us in a manner that will allow it to be used for recreational space.
Good, thank you. The other claim the government has made to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by more than 610,000 tonnes a year by 2021. How do you feel that lines up with the provision for smokestacks everywhere?
Well, it's all dependent upon the assumptions that have been used by the government in their planning for the project. I'm not an environmental expert, not a traffic expert, but my experience of the planning of the project so far, and the council's experience generally, has been that many things asserted by the government throughout the process have turned out to be incorrect and without justification.
Thank you. We'll move on to the government's questions.
Thank you.
Mr. Mallard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. River-Nile. Good afternoon, Your Worship.
Mallard, good to see you again.
Yes, always a pleasure to see you. I do visit your area. I'm not, obviously not senior enough to be acknowledged, but
You're welcome anytime.
thank you. You know, I was tempted to hand over to the Greens. It was so enjoyable, but that's a segue to my concern that you're a politician. I'm a politician. I've been in local government 12 years of my career, and that if you're conducting negotiations with the government via media releases and megaphones on milk crates and so forth, it is difficult to have a working relationship with the council. Now, I've been there before with South Sydney Council and the Eastern Distributor. We still managed to negotiate outcomes for our communities, largely by letting the bureaucrats have that respectful relationship with the RMS bureaucrats. So I put it to you that there's a breakdown in the relationship between your organisation and the government, perhaps, that's causing this problem.
Yeah. Well, I note that there was an intervening 18-month period in which myself and all of the other elected representatives of the councils were removed from office.
A lot bigger council now.
By dictate of the government, and a bureaucrat was appointed to be the dictator of the Inner West. And during that period, there was no discernible improvement in the outcomes for the Inner West from the WestConnex project. In fact, in my view, the inherent incapability of someone without a democratic mandate to effectively advocate for the community resulted in the government getting an easier run and having their way with the Inner West.
It might be time to wind the clock back, to restart the discussion.
Yep.
I mean, should be opportunities for you to extract additional benefits for the communities that you represent, in my view.
Yep.
Reverend Al referred to the 18 hectares of green space, 10 hectares at the Roselle rail yards. We're briefed that this is going to be available for sporting fields and amenities. You know, that's a real opportunity, the sort of thing that the old South Sydney Council was able to get in their package of agreements.
Yep.
So, I mean, what relationship have you got with the state government in regards to all these areas?
Look, our position is very simple. Whilst we are opposed in principle to the project and have campaigned against it vociferously, we are also fighting for every positive piece of mitigation that we can achieve that will reduce impacts on residents and result in good public policy outcomes. Now, I'm often criticised in the Inner West by some sections of the community and some people with a certain political disposition for holding that position. Some people say, no, if you propose any amelioration or mitigation, you're selling out the community and you're weakening your opposition to the project. We will continue to propose measures that can result in better outcomes for the people of Sydney, New South Wales, as well as the people of the Inner West. And I'm entirely open to negotiation and discussion with either bureaucratic officers or elected representatives from the government at any time.
Because, you know, based on my experience in the inner city, in South Sydney Council and the City of Sydney,
Yep.
The dire projection of what the world's going to be like after this infrastructure opens, you know, you talked about massive rat runs and so forth. After adjustment, I agree this didn't come true, and property prices improved and went up, and and the health impacts weren't as predicted. So I just put it to you that you can look around and see it has worked elsewhere.
Fair point.
Okay, let's talk about air quality. Are you aware, because again, reflecting on my own experience, I campaigned against the air filter, the air stack in East Sydney, right next to a council-owned childcare centre.
Yep.
It's still there today.
Yep.
Labor built it, unfiltered, right? Unfiltered.
Daniel was in high school.
Yes, well,
He probably was in the childcare centre at the time.
There's a reasonable chance I was.
You were breathing it in.
and I'm photographed standing. I'm photographed standing in front of it with a crowd with Irene Doutney, the late Irene Doutney, fighting against that stack. It's still there. The health. We're not aware of the dire health consequences, but the one I want to put to you is the government. In reflecting the comments you've been talking about, the government leadership, have made reforms called the government tunnel air quality reforms, which are only, I think, this year. Are you aware of those?
I'm familiar with that, yes.
So the first time in history of this state, probably of Australia, every year, every single tunnel individually were required to get an environmental protection licence from the EPA, and it will be assessed independently by the EPA for that. Retrospectively, the old ones that Labor built and the new ones, which are much better, we heard that in evidence today, a lot of it's to do with tunnel design, not just the design of the extraction, will all have annual EPA licences, which of course is a real, you have to agree, is a sense of some independent oversight for the community.
Well, firstly, I am enjoying the trip down memory lane, and I was always a fan of your local government career. So Mallard's greatest hits is always something that's good to partake in.
I'm a duck pond.
I welcome any improvement to regulation of air quality in relation to smokestacks, but I would again draw your attention to comments made within the last year by the Education Minister, presumably while these regulations were being developed, that, quote, I won't be party to putting stacks near kids. There's no way in hell that I'd support any development that will put the lives of pupils, teachers and parents at risk, and that certainly is incongruous with your assertions.
I certainly wouldn't want to dredge up other quotes and play quote games, but the point being that these reforms, which we've put in place, which Labor didn't put in place, do have an independent oversight. For example, the New South Wales Chief Health Officer has to do a statement on the potential health impact before the stack can proceed in its location. So are you aware of that?
I wasn't aware of that, no.
All right, you might want to get across some of those issues there. So there has been quite an advance on the issue of stacks. The issue of I was pretty taken back. You said it today, and I've seen you say it in the media, that suddenly you lament the Balmain Tiger site when the council which you were mayor of, previous council, my understanding anyway, had fought against every development proposal for that, what is a derelict, almost like war zone looking site I saw in your community. And now there's an opportunity that the government has identified it as a site to clear it, right? And then return it back to the urban development is what I'm advised, but I put it to you should be arguing for something more for the community out of that. Isn't that hypocritical for the council to have fought against every development that would have got the tigers back to that site, and now to say, oh, the government's stopping the tigers?
Well, we could have a whole inquiry into the history of the Balmain Leagues Club site.
It was a royal commission, wasn't it?
Does take up a lot of it can take up a lot of time. The fact is that no development application has ever been determined by Leichhardt Council or the Inner West Council in relation to that site. On multiple occasions, applications have been refused by state government agencies, by state government appointed planning panels, most recently by the Land and Environment Court. And the primary reason for the refusal of each of those applications was because a very powerful state government agency, Roads and Maritime Services, and I think it actually predates RMS, the RTA in the first instance, were unimplacably, since 2011, were unimplacably opposed to the project. There is a new owner of the site who has submitted a development application to council and an amended DCP. I note that there is an existing approval through Leichhardt Council, which I initiated and sponsored, for an 8-storey development on that site, which we know is commercially viable. My point is this. I think by any measure, the amenity and health and safety impacts of having a mine in the middle of Rozelle Shopping Centre, with all of the spoil and all of the truck movements that are associated with that, as opposed to a development of up to 12 storeys, which is what's allowable under the LEP, that the former option would be much worse. And I do think it's a conflict of interest, since you brought it up, the fact that if the DA is to be determined, it will be determined by a state government appointed planning panel, whilst at the same time the same state government is seeking to acquire the site through compulsory acquisition.
No.
Just Mr. Mayor, just before for Hansard, you just need to tell us LEP and DCP, just so we can get the...
Short answer, no, that one.
Local Environment Plan and Development Control Plan.
Okay.
To be clear.
101 of planning. Thank you, Mr.
Not all of
Chairman.
us are councillors.
Thanks. Just a few questions.
Phelps,
Firstly, I do commend you. You oppose the project, but you seek to ameliorate what you see as the disadvantages to your community. So I think that's an entirely honourable and responsible move. Mr. Mayor?
Thank you. I'm not sure that endorsement will help me, but please proceed.
Would it be fair to say that for your council, the expanded council, the problem is that the missing link was never built in the first place?
No, that's not my view, no.
Okay. Given that the original plan for the Western Sydney connection was an above-ground highway all through the inner west, ultimately meeting up to its current location in Strathfield,
Yep.
that area had been reserved for that, and for reasons we all know, that land was sold off. But given that it does stop in Strathfield, and there is no existing link which can carry the projected, or the current, much less the projected capacity of transport coming in from the west. Don't you think that going underground is at least the least worst option?
Well, I don't see it as my role to resolve the very long-standing and vast array of problems that have developed with the WestConnex project. Our role is to make submissions and advocate for improvements to the project or for the project's cancellation. I think that ship has sailed. Well, there you go. It's the difference in some opinions. And so, look, it's a hypothetical question. If I were the Roads Minister or the Minister for WestConnex, it'd be a fair question to put to me. That's a matter for Minister Ayres or the Premier to resolve. But I stand by the position that I put previously, that the planning for this project has been shocking. It's been the worst planned infrastructure project in the history of New South Wales.
Just one final question before.
No, we're out of time.
The Rumcall Hospital.
So we've got to be back here at
3 o'clock.
3 o'clock.
Yeah, 10
Just 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much
I enjoyed you guys. That was a pretty
for
good plan.
appearing before our committee. And
Thanks for the
also,
opportunity.
for the information you've provided for us. It's been very important. And I'm personally a great supporter of local government, so
So am I.
that's why I raised that earlier question about giving greater power to local government in these issues. Now, questions on notice, you have 21 days to answer those, and the Secretariat will send the question to you. So there's no confusion as to what questions are on notice, and you'll have 21 days to reply from the time you get it.
Thank you very much. Chair, are we back at 3:05?
We'll now break for afternoon tea.
3:05?
Witnesses from the Annandale and Leichhardt Community Panel with 4 representatives. So could each witness, starting from my left, please state their name and position title and swear either an oath or affirmation. The words are on the cards in front of you.
My name is Kelvin Reardon. I'm a co-convener of Annandale Now, and I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
My name is Richard Dudley Smith. I'm a co-convener of Now Annandale, and I solemnly and sincerely and truly declare then and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Anne-Therese King. I am the Vice President and WestConnex Liaison Officer of Sydney Secondary College Leichhardt Parents and Citizens Association, or Leichhardt IPNC. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Good. Thank you. Ms. Crawford.
My name is Jane Crawford. I'm the current president of the Sydney Secondary College Leichhardt Council, PNC. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Thank you. Do you wish to make an opening statement, any of the witnesses?
We would wish to make one.
Yes, thank you.
Shall we proceed? Thank you, Reverend Nile, and members of the Public Accountability Committee for this opportunity to address you today. Our submission outlines in more detail, obviously, what we are about to say. Over a 6-year period from February 2017, when our school community was first confronted with possible WestConnex impacts and first spent energy, time and money addressing them, to when WestConnex Stage 3 may be finalised in 2023, almost 6,500 students and their families will have passed through our school. We submit that the health, safety, welfare and educational experience of these students was not formally assessed as it should have been before ever commencing such a project, that appropriate risk and cost assessments were not fed into an overall business case before ever deciding whether to greenlight it. As such, our concerns speak to the inquiry's terms of reference A, C and J. We remain highly concerned about sound public accountability processes with respect of the rollout. The most glaring, we refer to 2 examples in our submission that are no longer current of impacts, but that they should ever have been advanced, demonstrates the highly concerning and chaotic processes that have been in play for this project. The most glaring example was the dubious risk assessment processes and inadequate true costings to a school community of a proposed mid-tunnel dive site on land directly abutting the school and wrapping the school's only oval, as per the picture in our submission. We only have one oval. We do not have 9, 3, 5. Horror can only describe the school community's reaction when, in February 2017, we learnt that this was nominated. In the Herald, it was described as a favoured and likely site. It is a major digging, drilling and excavation site, a mid-tunnel dive site, and it would have removed spoil for 4 to 5 years every 4 minutes. Yet this site was 20 metres from one of our school's main entrance gates, used during the day and before and after school by students. 36 metres from indoor classrooms and the school library, no intervening buffers, buildings, and wrapped the school's only oval. Our campus is already smaller than DEC recommended size for an inner suburban school and has less outdoor space per student than nearly all other high schools in the state, but it would have been rendered unusable. How could it ever have been possible to nominate such a site for a school for children aged 11 to 16? Where were the formal risk assessments of children's health and safety? Where were the vulnerable populations in the school assessed, children with autism or mental health issues, when drilling and vibration started? Where was the occupational health and safety assessment for staff? Where were the costs calculated of potential relocation costs of some or all of the student population? Or the potential legal costs when parents took class actions against the government for the appalling loss and disadvantage in education? A current proposal remains the mainline tunnels directly under our school. We have not been formally notified about this, but the parents attend a consultation meeting with RMS. We inform the principal, and the principal informs the Department of Education as to what will happen with respect of tunnels going under our school. This doesn't seem a sound process. They will likely meet underneath our school, and 2 phases of the project with different contractors will likely meet under our school. And yet there's still an extremely vague communication about this. We also have 2 other. Dan Murphy's dive site was also nominated, subsequent to ours. Only when it was axed in June did the RMS representative admit that this was good news for the safety of our students who spill out of the light rail station en masse at that site. So we also have costs involved in the traffic delays of inter-campus travelling and all sorts of other activities anticipated over the next 5 years with the construction interference to traffic. We also are highly concerned about the ventilation stacks and what that means for the health of our students. Thank you. We remain concerned about public accountability due processes with respect of risk and costs.
Thank you. Is there any other opening statements? Yes, thank you. Mr. Reardon.
Thank you, Chair and members of the committee. The residents of Annandale would like to bring to the committee's attention a number of major concerns they have that have been imposed on them by the intended construction of the WestConnex through their suburb. Of major importance is the total disregard of the health and safety concerns associated with Johnston Street, a street of major importance throughout Annandale. The RMS describes Johnston Street as an arterial road. It is in fact a major historic residential street of 258 residential lots, consisting of the most significant historic houses in the suburb, including the Witches' Houses and the Abbey. There are also 3 primary schools, 2 aged care facilities and 2 childcare centres along this street. It is of extreme concern that this street in particular is going to be subjected to a huge increase of diesel trucks using this street daily, which will cause a massive increase of serious particulate pollution. Along with this, there will be all the associated dangers to pedestrians and particularly children of serious traffic accidents. What is unforgivable is that the RMS knew that Johnston Street was going to be used as the truck route to the Camperdown dive site prior to the issuing of the EIS, and yet it was not disclosed in their EIS. Richard Dudley Smith and Sally Hardy two members of the now WestConnex uncovered this information at a community consultation from a WestConnex staffer when they obtained an admission that the trucks were to be stationed at White Bay and that Johnston Street was to be the truck route, not Parramatta Road, as had previously been stated. This information was only disclosed and confirmed in the PIR when the community had no opportunity to raise or submit objections. This is one deception of the community that has taken place and needs investigation. The concept plan for the M4-M5 link was indicative only. There were no firm designs, engineering or construction plans, all of which should have formed part of the EIS, as was the case for stages 1 and 2 of WestConnex. Therefore, the EIS for stage 3 should never have been approved by New South Wales Planning and the Minister, without all these necessary documents being present and proper procedures being followed. It needs to be investigated as to how this could have been allowed to happen, as it appears highly likely that the approval was given solely to facilitate the sale of Sydney Motor Corporation, even though this circumvented the normal procedures and statutory approval process. Annandale, and in fact all the surrounding suburbs, have very serious concerns with the unfiltered pollution stacks located in the Rozelle rail yards next to the City West link opposite the Crescent intersection. The Rozelle rail yards are a low-lying area of ground surrounded by suburbs on rising and higher ground. The stacks located there will be 38 metres above sea level. Streets, houses and schools in the surrounding areas are built on land that is in many cases on or approximately the same or above the level of the top of the stacks. Balmain Road, where it meets Victoria Road, is at 41 metres above sea level. Just opposite this intersection is Rozelle Primary School. Orange Grove Primary School, which is on Balmain Road towards Lilyfield, is at 33.5 metres above sea level at footpath level. Both these schools are within 800 metres of the Rozelle rail yard stacks. Pollution from these stacks will be at ground level in many of the surrounding areas. The three schools on Johnston Street, Annandale, are in virtually the same situation. This is totally unacceptable. These are just some of our concerns. In conclusion, this leads us to support other demands for a halt to this ill-conceived project, subject to a Royal Commission being called. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I?
Yes.
I would like to speak on behalf of the students. The students at our school were also alarmed by and actively resisted the proposed dive site adjacent to their school. The Student Representative Council created their own petition, gathering student signatures only, and with individuals donating their time away from studies, they raised over 360 student signatures in a short time. Students were baffled by the proposal. They knew the state government was responsible for WestConnex and therefore the proposed impacts to their school, which is also a state government owned and run. How could one part of the same government that delivered and supposedly cared so much about their education, on the other hand, also be behind this proposal? Why weren't those behind the proposal providing clear information and directly talking with the school community and stakeholders? Parents learned about the proposal on the news. Students were faced with a choice that their government either disregarded and discounted them and the negative impacts they would face, or their government was incompetent in proposing a site adjacent to their school in the first place. Either way, students learnt lessons from this direct encounter with state government, which were unlikely positive or inspiring, but will be with them for a very long time.
Thank you. We'll commence with the
Thank you, Chair.
Labor members of the committee.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming along.
Mr. Donnelly.
Thank you. Coming along this afternoon. Now, with the now submission, it's number 366. I'd just like to ask some questions, and with the Sydney Secondary College Leichhardt PNC, yours is 377. I've got some questions, but I'll deal first with now. With respect to the traffic mismanagement matters, you start on the bottom of, I've numbered the pages, although they weren't numbered. What is the second page goes over for the next two pages and to the next page after that. Beyond what was said in the opening statement, are there any other matters, particularly you're referring to matters with respect to Johnson Street, are there other traffic matters you want to particularly draw our attention to?
Well, are we talking about table 5/2?
Table.
5/2 without construction and...
So I haven't got a table in my
No,
submission.
no, okay. No, it's just in the paragraph at the bottom of the third page.
Okay, no, yes, no, no, okay, so in table, so I actually don't have that table, so what does that table say, or in it?
Well, it says without construct. It just says in the submission that table 5/2, the without construction, and the EIS option A for the City West Link PM Peak has eastbound at Fail. Is that what you're referring to?
Well, yes, I'm asking you, is there any particular parts in this section of your submission you'd like to elucidate and add some additional comment to?
Well, for example, that.
Yes.
That's virtually saying that the Anzac Bridge traffic is already at peak with the introduction of the civil site, Hanson's Concrete, and the truck marshalling yard. The three intersections around James Craig Road and the City West Link, and the Crescent.
Yep.
And another proposed intersection 400 metres further west for the Rozelle Rail Yards. They will be probably subjected to heaps more traffic than what is already there at the moment, and they're projecting that those will go from level of service levels of E through to F. Right. E is gridlock, F is fail.
Right. Yeah, please.
Yeah, well, the aspect about it, when the EIS came out, there were all the traffic prognosis in the EIS. It stated that the Rozelle Rail Yard would have 517 truck movements per day from that site. All the traffic modelling that was put in the EIS now is completely wrong, because none of the things that were considered in the EIS, at the time, there was no mention of Hanson's being relocated to the White Bay area. There was no mention at the time that the trucks would become based at the marshalling yards would be based at White Bay. There was no mention that the multi-use facility was going to be constructed and that would be numerous truck movements from there. And so the consequence was that in the EIS, the truck movements, although severe, the suggestion was, I think, 700 truck movements a day for around the Rozelle Rail Yard site. Now, as the IWC stated, these truck movements have now blown out to an enormous amount. From my own estimation, it's 3,500. But, as you know, the council have already said that it's over 4,000. Now, I can't ascertain how the council has arrived at those numbers. I've only worked out on the numbers that I can work out and arrived at this figure of 3,400. The other aspect of that is that all these trucks will be coming from White Bay, and the access to the rail yard site, as is stated in the EIS, the access point, the trucks were originally coming from the west. So they were coming from Haberfield, they were coming down the City West Link, and then they were turning into the rail yard site 400 metres before you get to the Crescent. They were going into the rail yard site there, filling up, and then exiting the rail yard site opposite the Crescent. There would be new traffic light systems put in both those locations, obviously with new traffic sequences involved. The difference now is that those trucks coming from the west empty would then just turn into the rail yard site. And then when they exited opposite the Crescent, they would have to cross the line of traffic to go back west, where they were, where the spoil is meant to be going. with the trucks now based in White Bay, the trucks that are going to be using the rail yard site are going to be coming out of James Craig Road. And so when they get onto James Craig, at the junction of James Craig Road, they then turn left onto the City West Link. Then, in order to access the rail yard site, they have to cross the line of traffic to access the rail yard site. Then they fill up. It doesn't matter which entrance they use, they have to then fill up.
Yeah.
And then when they fill up, they have to once again, they have to cross the line of traffic to get out. So as we're talking about, at least in that site, which is stated in the EAS, 500 and something truck movements a day, of which 200 apparently are at 200 plus are at peak periods, I think you could see that even that one thing is going to add massively to congestion.
Have to move on. Sorry, we've got a little bit of time. My colleague, you want to?
Sorry, thank you, Mr. Donnelly. Ms. King, you are the WestConnex liaison officer for the PNC, that's correct?
Yes.
And you act in a voluntary capacity?
Yes.
But your PNC has formally created this position?
Yes.
And is that because the level of interaction amongst your school community is such that such a position is required?
Interaction with the project?
Yep.
Yes, so there are 5 impacts on our school community. The position was created earlier this year after the RMS asked us whether we would like to be on a consultative committee, given that we presume it was given because the mainline tunnels were coming underneath our school.
Well, thank you for the work that you do on behalf of your school community, firstly in a voluntary capacity. Secondly, do your parents in your community trust what RMS tells them?
I think the President would be better to speak to.
The President is welcome to.
I mean, it's difficult speaking on behalf of all the parents in our community. I can speak about the ones who come to, and no, but I think it's part of, it is because the process to date, we haven't been approached, we haven't been consulted with as a stakeholder before the proposed dive site. Everyone heard about it through it appearing on various news
This is a dive site. That is a Dan Murphy dive site.
No, this is
a different one.
It's
no. So yeah, sorry, Jane. There was a proposal for a dive site literally on land wrapping the school's only oval. It's in the picture in the submission, and it abuts the school property. It is 36 metres from it would have been 36 metres from an indoor classroom and 20 metres from a school's main gate. It was favoured for a 6-week period whilst we fought to stop it, after which they advanced Dan Murphy's formally.
And did you, were RMS upfront?
No.
No.
They didn't provide any information. On that site are 2 former tram shed buildings, which the site is a triangular site and it's a complete subdivision. So it would make sense that eventually the school's already, as Anne-Teresa said, too small for the current guidelines, so that it would make sense that eventually that could become part of the school site. It's a natural kind of block, and 2 state heritage listed tram shed buildings on that site, they would have had to be demolished, but there was no mention of that.
My final question is, how much anxiety has this all created inside your school community, and how ongoing is that anxiety?
It's extreme anxiety, and as why I spoke separately representing the students. We have wonderful, informed, active, engaged students in our school, and they literally could not believe that this was being proposed to happen, to impact. It's actually within 36 metres of 20 classrooms with nothing in between, and the school library, which is a hub of, it's the IT centre, the hub of any presentations, etc. So the schools, and so naturally, there wasn't information provided as to really what was proposed, and so I think that secrecy has added to a certain cynicism. And going forward, we now look at maps where we're showing that the 2 tunnels connect underneath our school. And we feel as though we get, which I will call rather glib responses back from RMS, who are now, at least because of Anne-Teresa's time, we're in conversation with them. And these tunnels are actually going to overlap each other vertically underneath our school. And in any of the impact statements or diagrams about tunnelling, and he reassures us it's not going to be too close to the surface of our, close to the surface of our school. But there's no mention of two tunnels over the top of each other, what they're going to do in that situation.
Just how do we reconcile your anxiety with our...
Ms. Phelan.
Oh, sure. Sorry.
Okay, just finishing with that answer. Incredible anxiety over the dive site, and because of the dubious way that the whole thing happened, we continue to be anxious about the mainline tunnels, and it seems if we're not active, nothing comes to us. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
Right, Phelan.
Thank you for your representation of your communities and how much you work and fight on this issue. I'm aware of the I just can't imagine actually the hundreds, if not thousands, definitely thousands and more hours many people are putting in on this. So thank you. And on that, just in terms of a question on that, so 6 weeks it was from the time that you found out on the nightly news about this ridiculous proposal, 6 weeks of like how many hours, what was your time like in terms of fighting this? And now, of course, you're still doing that with the mainline tunnel proposal underneath. I'm just curious in terms of how much you're focusing on this as opposed to all of the other initiatives and things that the PNC...
Yeah, it completely dominated the PNC in that period. All the meeting was about was those issues in that period.
And there was an ongoing concern as well because there was no reassurance that there would that the site wouldn't be used for something else. So the community has always been concerned. The principal wasn't informed that the site wouldn't be used. In fact, there have been rumours at different stages of, and even, the fact that tunnels by two separate contractors are going to meet underneath our school.
Absolutely.
There's concern that, there'll be some complication that wasn't foreseen and that as a result there'll have to be an emergency dive site there, or that's the kind of scenario that the community is foreseeing, and we feel as though the impacts to the school haven't been considered.
The members of the committee worked like full-time, double shift.
Yeah.
Everything went off their agenda. I lost paid work over it. All sorts of for that 6 week period, and the meetings were thronged by parents coming in at that time. Yeah.
So you found out on the nightly news about the dive site. The mainline tunnels you found out because of your own work. Is that correct?
We saw it in the EIS, actually.
Really?
We read it ourselves and we pointed it out to the principal.
So what about the Department of Education?
They seem completely missing in action on everything. Yeah.
So
there's this curious silence that they're apparently not allowed to be involved. I mean, it seems incomprehensible that they aren't formally consulted and engaged with at the beginning of any major project like this.
It's particularly underneath the school. So they're aware of this now? Do you know?
Yeah, because we've informed them. The parents have informed the principal, who's informed their superiors in the Department of Education.
So in relation to this tunnel, have you had confirmation from the RMS that indeed it is looking very likely that it will go underneath your school?
Okay, so the EIS shows it definitely going underneath the school, but we know that from our that the final route will be decided by the contractor. It is. We are told it will be, after asking questions to the consultative committee specifically about, can you just give us an idea of the anticipated impacts so we can begin to make due preparations? Is there likely going to be noise, relocations, sensitive populations in the school, like autistic children who may need to be moved during drilling? So that we can we need you to know that it can't happen in exam times, or we need to make, relocations, performance times, debating times. These kind of questions, they look at us blankly and go, oh, yeah, okay. And then they'll have given us the information in response to that now through the consultative committee that it is likely that the tunnels will meet underneath the school. It's not 100%.
And so have they said, what does EIS say about risks in relation to subsidence then?
They don't discuss those as being any more of any greater concern under our school than anywhere else, and they don't do a formal risk assessment of sensitive receivers with respect of subsidence, to my understanding.
What do you mean by sensitive receivers?
Well, I think sensitive receivers is what I understand is certain populations.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that. I think Mr. Reardon and Mr. Dudley Smith as well, I'm particularly interested in the time that you have both spent fighting and representing your communities as well. If you would like to inform the committee what toll it's taken on you personally and how many hours you think you've given up to represent your community and be here today.
I couldn't say how many hours I put in. I've been doing this for the last 3 years. I can't imagine how many rallies, demonstrations, community consultations, stalls on the street to try and inform the public.
Publications, documents.
Oh yeah, this to prepare all this for my own submission took a month of work. Yeah.
Mr. Reardon,
Well, thank you again.
Can I just see if Mr. Reardon also feels like...
Half the time that Richard's done, because I've only been here for about 18 months, but I've certainly put in the same sort of things on the stalls, and it does get wearing. Yeah, very wearing.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you again for appearing before our committee. Just following up some of the questions, you mentioned that you were given assurances that the spoilage hauling route would not traverse Annandale. How was this assurance provided to you? Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. I mean, that's on one of the very early, I can't remember even when it was, would have been 4 years ago at one of the first community meetings I went to at Leichhardt. No, it was at Leichhardt Town Hall, where the RMS addressed an audience there. And at the end of that, I asked the question if what was going to be the situation for Annandale, when I was told, oh, well, Annandale wouldn't really be affected. And so I then asked the question, so there wouldn't be any truck movements or anything through the Annandale area or Johnson Street, as that was a main thoroughfare, and I was told just word of mouth, no, that won't be the case. And in fact, actually, as you will have seen in the EIS to the Camperdown dive site, the spoil from the Camperdown dive site, the spoil trucks were initially coming down Parramatta Road and accessing the Camperdown dive site, which is, sorry, are you aware where it is? It's between Parramatta Road, Piermont Bridge Road and Mallet Street. It's on the triangle there. That's where I'm talking about. And the trucks were to come down Parramatta Road to access that dive site. It was only when I went to a community consultation session at Newtown and managed to cross-question one of the representatives of WestConnex there and challenged him about the problem of congestion, where in the other previous stage 1, where there'd been massive truck hold-ups at Burwood because trucks couldn't get into the sites. And I said, you can't allow that to happen here in this location. And only then did he say that, oh, well, he didn't think that would happen because perhaps they wouldn't be coming down Parramatta Road. So then I said, well, where would they be coming? Well, we might be going to locate them in White Bay. And then that whole thing, through a series of questions, I was able to uncover that, in fact, the truck route then being planned was that the trucks would be in White Bay and they would use Johnson Street and they would come down Johnson Street onto Parramatta Road and into the dive site there.
What was the approximate date that you got that information?
That would have been last year, before the EIS submissions had to be in. And
roughly what date was that? What month?
Gosh, I'd have to look it up. I can't tell you that accurately now. But
because you would have had no time to make a supplementary submission.
No.
Based on what you've just learned.
Oh well, I basically put that information into my submission to the EIS, saying that I received that information verbally, and that wasn't in the EIS. And the other thing that wasn't in the EIS, so the next thing I asked him was, okay, so how are the trucks going to get up Johnson Street, knowing that there was a historic bridge at the end of Johnson Street, and the turning circle would not allow a truck and a trailer to get up there from the lanes that are actually existing on the Crescent at the time and exist today. Then he had to admit that perhaps there was going to be another lane put into the Crescent, which would be solely for trucks. And that would, a lane obviously would be on the inside of the Crescent coming from City West Link. So it would be inside, and then there would be another sequence of traffic lights put in at the bottom of Johnson Street, which would allow for trucks from the inside lane to turn up Johnson Street. That would, with a truck and a trailer, that would give them sufficient turning circle to be able to make that turn. And so that was also the only time that we knew then that that was going to happen. And then also at the same time we no, actually in the EIS it was stated that Burrawong Park was going to be taken, which the mayor of Inner West Council failed to mention, that the whole of Burrawong Park at the end of the Crescent is going to be taken as well.
You raised in regard to the haulage trucks a figure of 183 so far. Is that correct? That's what you've been experiencing?
Oh, sorry, no, that's so far in relation to my adding up of the 122 a day that was in the EIS that they predicted for Johnson Street, plus another 50 from the concrete, Hanson's concrete batching.
And yet there were alternative routes that you suggested that could have been used instead of Johnson Street.
Well, no, I didn't suggest any alternative routes.
You couldn't think of any others. There are no others.
Well, in relation to that, it'd be only dobbing another street in Annandale, and that's the Crescent.
Yeah.
You could go up the Crescent.
You want to stop it altogether. Yeah.
Well, that's right. Yeah, of course. 58. There's only 58 residential lots between up to the turning point into Piermont Bridge Road going that way.
Now we'll move on to the government members. Dr. Phelps.
Thanks, Right. I just want to take you up on that, and that is, comparatively, Johnson Street is significantly wider than is Piermont Bridge Road up to Mallet Street, is it not?
That's correct.
So Johnson Street, if you like, offers better access for trucks.
That's correct.
Okay.
It still has three
but it is still a residential street.
And it still has 3 primary schools, and two aged care centres and two preschools on it, with a total of at least 1,500 students.
And if you go up Piermont Bridge Road and then turn left, you'll also run past a whole range of heritage houses, and from the old Children's Hospital, a large number of residential apartments. And then when you turn onto the Crescent, you'll also have more heritage houses and more residential apartments all the way down to the bay. Is that not correct?
Yes, you do.
Yeah.
I lived in Camperdown for many, many years.
Yeah, so
I've
you
got
know,
very good understanding of the area.
The problem with this whole scenario is the pollution. You know, I don't know if you, last night on SBS there was a programme in Britain about the air pollution and what a terrible problem it is. $20 billion it's costing. 40,000 people are dying a year of air pollution, and this whole programme showed exactly the situation that we're in today, where you've got schools on a high street with slow, congested traffic, and I would recommend that you all watch it, to be honest.
Certainly, and some of us have actually lived it, having gone to Camperdown Demonstration School as an infants and primary, which is now Bridge Road School, as I believe, and then having walked down there every day to catch the 465 bus to Summerhill Public School, and then having walked down there every day to catch the bus on Parramatta Road to Fort Street High School. So I'm fully aware of the nature of...
Then you should be talking to Ray Nasser and get him here before the inquiry, because he is an expert on it. You know, look at my age. I'm 72. I grew up in London in the 1950s. I remember the pea super fogs, which were a joke, and yet in 1952 they had 4 or 5 days of this exceptional fog, and then only later on did the government say that actually 5,000...
They introduced the Clean Air Act, yes.
Well, 5,000
the Tory
people
government
had died
introduced the
and-
Clean Air Act.
It doesn't matter. It was Churchill, if you want to know, but who cares?
Pretty sure Churchill was a Tory.
But
Anyway, just getting back to it.
the situation is that, you know, you can't just turn to the past and say, well, in 19th century Britain, you had the most terrible pollution from coal mines, and say, well,
I'm just saying that
today.
people who claim that in some distant past the inner west was
Point
a
of order,
wonderful
Chair. Point of order,
utopia
Chair.
where there was no traffic.
No, it wasn't at all.
no one
But
has ever
why
claimed that.
are you
that's
going
fine.
to inflict
Chair,
additional
point of order?
when you know how
He's asking
dangerous
you
it is?
questions.
Sorry.
Well, he took about 17 statements to get to the question, so that was my point of order.
Could you move on to the question, Dr. Phil?
Certainly. Do you have confidence in the Environmental Protection Agency?
It's very difficult to say.
I'm not an expert.
That's fair enough. Do you have confidence in the New South Wales Chief Health Officer, Kerry Chant?
Again, I'm not an expert in health. This is why we'd like to get experts.
Do you have confidence in the Independent Advisory Committee on Tunnel Air Quality?
No.
Okay, that's fine. Just in relation to Hanson's concrete batching plant at White Bay,
Yes.
do you agree that there'll be reduced potential queuing and congestion on local streets
No.
in the course of that?
No, I don't.
Why would there be? There's going to be an increase in trucks that we haven't had before.
But having them marshalled in one particular area keeps them off those streets until those times that they're needed. Is that not correct?
Well, that may be correct, but they're still coming up Johnston Street.
But what?
So how do you propose to get concrete to the site if not in trucks on roads?
I don't care if you put it...
Okay, so your fundamental proposition is that you disagree with WestConnex and you don't believe it should be proceeded, Stage 3 should be proceeded with.
That's right.
Absolutely.
That's fine.
Absolutely.
That's fine.
Yes.
Okay, well, I think that bird has flown.
Well,
So I don't think that there's...
Hey, Stage 3 isn't done yet.
No, that's true.
the situation is that, in fact, you should be looking at what they're doing in London. We're talking about a few thousand extra vehicles coming into the city. That's what you're trying to achieve for a fantastic amount of money. The Crossrail in London is 70 kilometres long. It's going to open next year. It's 40 stations, 10 of which are brand new. It's going to move 200 million people a year. And the cost of that, when I went into it, was a staggering $25 billion, $25 billion Australian. And we've got what we've managed to achieve on this WestConnex, which is really a piddly little project, is already costing that money.
Okay, if I could now move to... building the metro, but I have to move on to Sydney Secondary College.
But
Are you, I would say?
But without anywhere near the 200 million
I'm talking
people.
about West.
I understand you had problems in relation to the design process, but in the end, the contractor redefined their design and no longer needed the proposed dive sites at the tram sheds and Darley Road. Is that correct?
One of the contractors out of 3 proposed that they didn't need a dive site
Now,
in June this year.
do you consider that to be a good outcome?
Yes, of course.
So would it be fair to say that that is how a community consultation process should be run?
No.
No, our central thesis is that true costs of a huge project like this need to be considered much more thoroughly at the beginning of the process, because how can you have a sound business case if you don't have a sound cost-benefit analysis? And if you overlook all these hidden costs on hundreds of people and communities, whether it's our school or whether it's the wider community, you cannot have a sound business case.
And if you haven't communicated with the stakeholders, how do you know what the likely negative impacts to them will be? If you show such gross misunderstanding or negligence of how a school community functions as to propose to put a site there, how can you foresee what the negative impacts will be?
So
if you don't communicate with
something
those
is
stakeholders.
proposed, and then on the basis of community feedback, it's deleted.
No, hang on, it's proposed. How is it communicated to us when it's proposed? How is it communicated to the stakeholders when it's proposed?
Well,
there was no consultation.
So is that a?
They found out about it on the nightly news. Remember?
Is that community consultation, as it should be?
I don't know what was in the minds of RMS at the time. They may well have been planning to send out to all affected parties notifications, but can you think of any other project in New South Wales which has had more community consultation than WestConnex?
It's not our job to
Well, actually, no, I can interject. I work professionally as an architect and urban designer, and I know due community consultation that occurs on a standard project, you can be adding on, the most basic addition, and you have to comply with something that seems like way more due process than has taken place with this massive project.
Just in relation to tunnel air quality and your concerns about tunnel air quality, again, I'll pose the same questions. Do you have confidence in the New South Wales EPA?
Question mark. So it's not a yes or a no. Sorry, are you talking?
I'd like to continue here.
Yep.
We don't, and it's our understanding that the air quality monitoring that's meant to be done by the EPA at the moment is currently down at Cullen Park, and the monitors down there have not functioned for the last 3 to 5 years, is what we've been informed. And so the PNC, we have actively sought out, many of the PNCs in our area have forked out up to $60,000 on air quality monitoring. Oh. We have found out about a project where we can get, and we have just commissioned an air quality monitor for our school, and the information and data collected will then be part of public data available for everyone to assess. So no.
Baseline readings at the current time?
That's correct.
So when you say that your school, does that mean the PNC raised it?
Yeah. Well, we have found an avenue that isn't that expensive, and we are investing that. It's not in place at the moment.
Investing in air monitoring.
Absolutely.
Yes, we are not the only PNC. We are not the only PNC to be doing this.
Other schools are investing $60,000 in air quality monitoring.
Not books.
Have you requested the government?
And so I think that demonstrates a lack of faith in the current air quality monitoring.
The air quality monitoring at Cullen Park is in the middle of a park on a lovely hill, so it's not a very accurate representation. But there's a great deal of controversial information about the ventilation stacks, and we cannot have full confidence at the moment.
Well, thank you very much for appearing before our inquiry. We appreciate all the work you're doing on behalf of the children of your school and other schools. So thank you.
Yeah.
If you have, I'm not sure we had any questions on notice, did we?
Oh, we might have some.
We did? If there are any questions on notice, the Secretariat will send them to you as a reminder, and then you have 21 days to answer that question. So thank you again for appearing before us.
Mr. Chair, could I just mention one thing?
Yes?
If this inquiry or commission hasn't yet called as a witness, I'd suggest you might call Childs.
No, Noel Child. Yep.
Yeah, Dr. Noel Childs, and get his version on air tunnel quality.
He's a tunnel expert.
Might be worth your while.
Good. Thank you for that suggestion. We'll follow it up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Searle for appearing before our inquiry and for your submission. So if you could please state your name, position, title, and then swear on the oath or affirmation, and the words on the cards in front of you.
Yes, I'm Dr. Glenn Hartley Searle, Adjunct Associate Professor of Planning at the University of Sydney. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Thank you. Do you wish to make an opening statement?
Yes, please, if I may.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I want to point out that any views I give are offered in a personal capacity, not necessarily those of the University of Sydney. My submission to the committee focuses on costs that could or should have been included in the WestConnex business case. One of the key omissions in the business case is the cost of upgrading connecting roads, which has been estimated at a minimum of $1 billion for the St Peters interchange alone. The business case does not cost increases in traffic congestion where traffic leaves WestConnex and inner Sydney, with traffic generated by WestConnex being beyond the capacity of Anzac Bridge and the Harbour Bridge by 2031 as one example. Nor does the business case include the negative health outcomes to residents from construction-related stress and ongoing noise and pollution stack emissions. These are serious uncosted negative amenity effects that include noise and other impacts from the motorway. These will lead to lower property values of houses next to surface sections of the motorway, but these property losses are not included in the business case. The cost of land for interchanges is undervalued because it does not consider alternative higher value uses. The lost heritage value in Haberfield is omitted. Increased congestion costs during construction have been left out of the business case, as have losses of revenue to businesses adjacent to project construction or businesses affected by traffic diversions required for construction. There is no inclusion of public transport losses arising from 45,000 trips being switched to WestConnex each day. There is also no consideration of the public sector infrastructure costs of increased urban sprawl arising from being able to commute from further out. As well, the business case greatly overstates one of the main claimed benefits, increased productivity in inner Sydney brought about by better access for Western Sydney workers. This is because the job increases required to produce the extra productivity in central Sydney and the Bays precinct in particular are much more likely to be based on public transport access, not motorway access. My submission is that these analytical shortcomings put the business case to construct WestConnex into serious doubt. Thank you.
Good, thank you. We'll commence with questions from
Thank you, Chair.
the opposition members.
And thank you, Dr. Soft, for coming along this afternoon. And we've received your submission, your paper in fact, which was presented at a conference in Adelaide late last year. It's submission number 3. Going to that submission, I'll ask you some questions, but before I do, in terms of all large projects, all large infrastructure projects, irrespective of what jurisdiction they are being developed in Australia, I would have thought by the second decade of the 21st century, there'd be pretty well understood parameters around which business cases ought be done, and some broad agreement or consensus about what those elements are. Is there essentially that understanding that there are basic key elements in a business case that really do need to be incorporated if that business case, is to be seen to have, any real bona fides? Or is it, are we talking about a very debatable point and really we've just got competing views?
I think it's a mixture of both. I think there are certainly there's some consensus about the central things that should be included in a business case, cost-benefit analysis, if you like. But there's also a debate about things that should be included but which are difficult to measure or sometimes left out because the project doesn't have enough analysis costs. So there are some items on the margin, including those which I've included in my submission, which are not always included, and certainly in many cases not included because they're difficult to measure, so they're rather conceptual rather than sort of practically included in all business cases. But there are other items such as changes in property values and so on, which I think would be considered to be important to include in a standard business case.
And your understanding is that that wasn't or didn't form a component part of the business case for WestConnex?
I think the business case includes the bare minimum of what you can include, and I think that the things that are left out tend to be extra costs that are left out for convenience, if you like, and I think that those costs are important. But so there is a bare minimum of business cost analysis in the paper, but that's about it.
Okay, just go to page 7 of your submission and going on to page 8, and I think also over 9, 10. The CBA planning items inadequately costed. So as you're, having looked at this and studied it, you've come to the conclusion that there is some serious inadequacies in the costings that have been done, or would you judge it less harshly than that and say, well, that...
No, I think serious inadequacies is the level I'd put it at.
Serious.
I mean, in particular, the bits of infrastructure which have been had to be built to make WestConnex happen, which haven't been included in the business case. So that's a serious omission. So you're talking about the 1 billion cost rather of upgrading the roads around Alexandria to cope with traffic off the St Peters interchange. So that's just one example. I think the Gateway project, and it's unclear from the publicly available papers whether the Gateway project was assumed to be part of the WestConnex case in terms of traffic congestion analysis or not. So that's a several $billion project. And if the WestConnex cases assume that will handle traffic coming off of WestConnex going towards the airport and the port, then the cost of the Gateway project and the benefits that might come from that should have been included in WestConnex, and that's a very serious admission.
Is it another example of that, Dr. Sell, the $162 million spent from the Housing Acceleration Fund for the Hill Road upgrades that were in stage one?
Yes, that's another example, yes. So you could go through a number of cases like that, and that's certainly
So a fund that's purported purpose is to expand housing supply used to pay for WestConnex integration works is an example of what you're talking about.
Well, that particular piece of infrastructure is certainly an example, yes. I mean, the means by which it's paid is another question. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yes. I mean, it seems odd to me, and other members can speak for themselves, but we're talking about large chunks that really have not been accounted for, and it's evolved. The project is evolved. It's sort of developed, and which is different from the way it was put, I think, to the people of New South Wales. That this is a project, and it was, I guess, presented as such. But we find these component parts are sitting out there, and we're learning as we're going along.
Yes.
And trying to reconcile them with what was originally put and squaring them up in terms of how it all fits together, and met with the constant response by the government and bureaucrats that when we probe into the details, it's matters of commercial in confidence. Yes. I'm just wondering, trying to understand commercial in confidence, I must say, is a terribly challenging thing. I mean, it just seems to be the blanket that's thrown over any question that seeks to put some shafts of light into understanding some of these big numbers. I mean, are these legitimate claims to say it's business in confidence? You can't understand these
Well, that really wasn't the focus of my submission, but I mean, I would say that there's certainly a lack of transparency in these kinds of things, and I'm not always sure that it does affect business confidence, although in this case, of course, WestConnex project was up for sale, so without being inside the equation, if you like, and knowing what was hidden, it's difficult to say.
Fair enough. No, I just, I think, yeah.
Dr. Sell, the business case in its first iteration was prepared around circa 2013, 2014, and then its updated version was in November 2015. That accords with your memory, you would agree with that?
I just checked the most recent business case when I did my analysis. So I didn't check.
RMS says that at the time that they complied with the requirements of Infrastructure Australia, which were imposed upon them as a condition of the federal government's loan. Do you have a view that Infrastructure Australia's guidelines, which RMS has said they have to follow, are fit for purpose?
By and large, yes, but the co-author of the submission and myself have talked with Infrastructure Australia in Sydney. We wrote an article in the Conversation, which was based on this project and a couple of others, and we saw shortcomings in the analyses across the board. Infrastructure Australia's view is that they are forced to really basically take what's given to them by the states. They haven't got the capacity to redo the analysis, so they are concerned with the quality of business case analyses coming to them, such as WestConnex business case. They didn't say that one in particular, but that's the general concern.
And since this project was first conceived now nearly 8 years ago, those guidelines have changed, both at an Infrastructure Australia level, but equally Infrastructure New South Wales have changed, and it's prompted this concern amongst the community that if this project was going through the existing standards, it wouldn't get approval. Would you agree with that?
Without doing the numbers on what's been left out, but I'd think that it would be a very marginal case at best and probably not approved. Yeah.
So I ask this because it's not like this is a theoretical exercise. It's a major project component in its first business case. The Sydney Gateway has now been hived off. And we learnt this morning that a new business case has been prepared for that part of the project. What we don't know is whether or not that business case is to be public. And given that the WestConnex business case was actually the last business case this government made public in respect to any of its major infrastructure projects that are to do with transport, be it the Western Metro, Sydney Metro, all the other road projects, does it concern you that the RMS or Infrastructure New South Wales's failure to publish that business case means that the ability to scrutinise them in respect to the concerns that you've just listed is virtually impossible both for the Parliament and for the public?
Yes, I certainly agree. I think that the public's got a right to know what the business cases for all projects are so that there can be a public debate about orders of priority and so on.
Do you think they should publish it and we should make the publication of business cases like this a routine matter of law?
Well, certainly that's my view. It certainly was the case when I was working in the Department of Planning back in the 80s. All the environmental impact assessments contained a cost-benefit analysis, and that was a standard procedure. And now that's suddenly disappeared, and I think that's to the detriment of a public debate.
So it was good enough for when we had to build the M4, it was good enough for when we had to build all these other motorways, but somehow since in that period of time, we've decided that it's better that this information be kept secret.
Yes, that's unfortunately the case, yes.
Time's expired.
Move on
Chair.
to
Thank you, Dr.
the
Searle.
Greens.
I'm just wondering whether what other comparable projects, in New South Wales and Australia have undertaken BCAs that are better than the one we're talking about today.
Well, the East-West Link in Melbourne, I think, is the obvious example. In that case, they had to fudge the agglomeration economies which were produced by the project. They had an east-west link going across the CBD to the north, not linking into the CBD, and they had to add a transit route into the CBD as part of that overall business case analysis, and that was a complete fudge because they added on a bit of public transit to make the business case for the east-west link stack up. In the WestConnex case, that same thinking about agglomeration economies is being included, but as I've submitted in my paper, it's fallacious because the city can't handle the extra traffic which would come off WestConnex because of zoning restrictions in the city and other matters.
And so when you undertake your own cost-benefit analysis of WestConnex with all of the information that's available, and you include the kind of basic costs that you're here today saying that hasn't been included, such as, well, health impacts, possibly heritage loss, whatever you would say that you would include in terms of basic. And I'm assuming there's a gold standard of cost-benefit analysis, and then there's a basic one, which the government hasn't even done.
Health costs are fairly difficult, but I mean, theoretically, they should be included, yeah.
So have you undertaken your own cost-benefit analysis of the WestConnex project?
No, that's a huge project. I mean, they paid consultants millions of dollars, so I haven't had the capacity to do my own sort of version of. All I could do is really sort of point out the inadequacies of the business case, and that was about as far as I could go.
Yeah. So, but given the scale of the costs that haven't been included, you're suggesting, which I think you did in your opening statement, it's highly dubious that it would come out.
Yes, that's right.
On top.
Yeah.
I think you're aware of the SG and S economics paper that I think we're having a chat with them in a couple of days. They have said that it's highly unusual to have such a high probability of a project not coming in on budget. Would you like to provide comment on that?
No, I know they've done an analysis of that, but I haven't been across the construction costs, so I couldn't really answer that one.
Okay. I was particularly interested in your submission about the impacts on, for example, public transport, the negative impacts on public transport. I think you suggested the 45,000 fares. Yep. Could you just explain a little bit to the committee what the cost of moving people off public transport in the future is?
Right, so there are basically three possible outcomes when you lose 45,000 people.
And this is by...
Every day onto WestConnex. So,
yes, I think by the year though, was it 2030?
I can't remember the year,
Okay, no.
but that's on an average weekday, yeah.
Yeah.
So three costs. One, if nothing else happens, then what happens is that the bus system loses that revenue from 45,000 people, so there are extra losses to the public transport system. If the fares are increased to recoup those losses, then that's a cost to the people using the public transport system. Alternatively, if they try and reduce frequency of services to cover the loss of traffic, the loss of customers, then that's an increase in waiting time for those people using the bus system, and the time can be costed in money, as the traffic savings, of course, in WestConnex can be. So there are three types of costs which could come out from the 45,000 persons a day loss.
Well, because they've said 45,000 people a day, so...
sorry, trips, I mean, yes, so it could be 22 going each way. Yeah.
But in your opinion, so WestConnex could result in higher public transport fares for other people?
Well, I say it could go in either three directions. It could be higher fares, or could be extra losses, or could be increased waiting time if frequencies are reduced. So one of those three things, maybe all three.
Well, thank you.
Thank you again, Professor, for your assistance with our inquiry. Just some general questions. The general thrust of your paper seems to be focused on the inadequate manner in which projects like WestConnect have been costed. In light of externalities, such as those identified by other witnesses in this hearing earlier today, would that be a fair description?
That's part of it, but I'm also concerned with the things that, such as infrastructure costs necessary to make WestConnex happen, such as the extra road construction associated with the St Peters interchange. Those kinds of costs are also very significant. And the Gateway project, I think, is a very complex but important kind of a mission that has its own benefits. But basically, I think the WestConnex cases assume that the Gateway will be constructed, and therefore the cost should have been included within the WestConnex costs.
Well, some costs, as you would agree, are difficult to put in economic terms, such as disruption that results in the loss of community, the breakdown of intergenerational relationships caused by the loss of public space, like parks, for example. How could these be factored into the equation, into the costs?
Some of those are difficult to measure, but basically in economics, these things get reflected in property values, so that you can measure a lot of these things by the reduction in property values that happens when these things occur, and that's a fairly standard approach in economics, using a thing called hedonic price analysis, which uses all sorts of variables which you toss into the pot, and you see what the particular variable you're looking at, which is the construction of a motorway or the extra pollution caused by it, what effects that has on property prices. So that's a fairly standard technique.
Do you acknowledge the complexity involved in major transport overhauls that go across diverse urban communities and the difficulties in mitigating disruption to the lifestyle of residents?
Well, I mean, if there are costs to the community, I think they should be included, and these projects go ahead with maybe long-term benefits, but if there are costs that are being incurred as a result of those long-term benefits being obtained, I think those costs should definitely be included. So in the WestConnex case, as in most cost-benefit analysis, the costs during construction to communities and to business and so on are not included, and they can be very significant, as we've seen with the light rail project, and definitely should be included as part of project costs.
Can you quote any examples where mitigation was more successfully achieved?
Mitigation of what? Sorry.
The impact on the diverse urban communities, etc., lifestyle of residents.
Construction impacts, do you mean, Chairman?
Yeah.
I'm not sure how to answer the question. I'm sorry. No.
Well, do you think the WestConnex has appropriate mitigation strategies in place?
Oh, okay, so in those terms, from what I've seen, there are some potential mitigating factors, and they're a plus, but the mitigation costs are not sort of set against any costs that are being sort of saved or incurred, and whether the mitigation costs actually do ameliorate all of the costs that they're trying to ameliorate. So again, it's a question of including all the expenditure on mitigation costs and seeing what other costs might still remain after you've spent the money on mitigation.
What would you have thought was a reasonable approach that might have been taken in the light of the size and extent of the WestConnex project?
A reasonable approach?
Yes. What could have been done in the light of the size and extent of the WestConnex project.
Well, the
It's
basic,
probably the biggest project.
the basic issue was things like connecting with the eastern part of Sydney, particularly the airport and central Sydney, and relieving congestion on Parramatta Road. I think there are alternatives to those kinds of issues, and I think that, for example, better rail connections between, say, the airport and Parramatta would have been one alternative. In terms of Parramatta Road traffic, I think the case put out by the City of Sydney for an alternative which would have got traffic off Parramatta Road sort of deserves some sort of merit. I haven't gone into specific alternatives, but I think that there should have been a wider range of alternatives considered, particularly sort of improving rail traffic across Western Sydney from Parramatta to Central Sydney and then down to the airport.
Move on to the government representatives.
Thanks very much. Dr. Searle, have you read the government's submission to the WestConnex inquiry, specifically the section relating to the WestConnex business case?
I haven't, no.
Okay. You seem critical of it, but you haven't read it.
Correct.
Thank you. Are you aware that the Auditor General stated, while our audit did not seek to establish whether the WestConnex project represented value for money, nothing came to our attention during the audit which led to significant concerns with respect to this issue?
Okay, I know that, yes.
Or that Infrastructure Australia's assessment was, quote, the estimated benefits of the project are currently 80% higher than the estimated costs, and that the high degree of comfort, there is a degree of confidence that following an adjustment to the BCR for P90 and any negative adjustments due to induced trips, the BCR will remain positive.
Yeah, well, that's certainly the case. If you take away the agglomeration economies, the benefit cost ratio is still about 1.2, but that's very low in the order of general public investment. There are a lot of other projects out there with benefit cost ratios of much higher than that, which would make a better use of public funds. And as I say, once you start to include the omitted costs, such as the extra road costs from the St Peters interchange and such things adding up to several $1 billion, then that takes the benefit cost ratio ostensibly perhaps below 1 to 1.
Okay, just taking up on that, and if you like, the issue of incidental costs, you'd probably be aware that the growth of Sydney, the suburban sprawl, was largely occasioned by rail lines being built in a particular area, and at the end of the rail line you would have some sort of urban development. Is it appropriate, would it have been appropriate to cost the rail line to include the roads, the sewerage, the other facilities, the police stations, the schools, in the cost of the rail line, or are they incidental to the creation of that rail line?
Well, I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. I think they're all infrastructure costs associated with that urban development in that area. So,
but they're not costs associated with the rail line. They're attendant costs on the construction of a transport route, are they not?
They're all part of urban development in those new suburbs, and so the rail cost is part of that cost of total urban development.
No doubt about that. The question is that the urban development costs, are they part of the cost of the rail line?
The urban development costs, no, they're not.
So why should the arterial connections to this be considered to be part of the development itself?
So you're talking which development itself are you talking
to the WestConnex? Why do you consider the arterial connections to WestConnex to be part of the WestConnex itself?
Because they're necessary to get traffic onto WestConnex, or to get traffic to leave WestConnex and get into the areas where it's people want to go to from WestConnex.
In the same way that urban development in greenfield sites at the end of railway lines is necessary to get traffic onto the railway lines, is it not?
Sorry, that's illogical.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Can you clear the gallery? I've been continually interrupted by the gallery.
On the point of order, perhaps before we clear the room, we might just wish to warn
clear the room.
Yeah, we might just want to remind the audience that a more passive contribution is welcome than an active one.
Yes, I think getting back to that point, though, I think that part of it is a capacity issue. There's very little capacity on the roads which are supposed to take traffic coming off WestConnex, so it's necessary to increase the expenditure to expand that capacity. If you're talking about roads coming into rail stations in, say, outer suburbs, then usually there's a fair bit of capacity involved in those roads, and you don't need much addition beyond serving just local needs, and the local roads can handle traffic that wants to go to the railway stations. So I don't think it's an equivalent comparison.
Do you agree with the statement in the government submission, the updated economic analysis, which was requested by the Auditor-General, undertaken demonstrated that WestConnex was economically viable and will return $1.88 to the New South Wales economy for every dollar invested. WestConnex has a benefit-cost ratio of 1.71 without wider economic benefits and a 1.88 with wider economic benefits.
Well, as I said, I think it's disputable in terms of what's been left out, so that if you accept the business case for what it is, then you know, the figures have been presumably correctly calculated and so forth, but there are a lot of serious omissions in terms of what has been left out, and that certainly makes the benefit-cost ratio, as analysed in the business case, seriously in doubt.
But nonetheless still greater than 1.
It's very difficult to say. As I say, I think the things that have been left out are in the sort of terms of the billions, and I think it sort of makes it a very line ball and dubious proposition without doing sort of a detailed comparison of exactly what has been left out. But those omissions are very, very significant.
Mallard, you got any questions?
Yeah, just a quick one. Thank you, Dr. Searle. You've been your adjutant associate professor. How long have you been in that role at the University of Sydney?
For 3 years, and before that I was associate professor at the University of Queensland. Yeah.
Okay, so you've had in Queensland 3 years before that.
I was in Queensland for 4 or 5 years. Before that I was a senior lecturer at the University of Technology for 15 years.
Okay, so I mean, stepping back from WestConnex to the broader issue, the government's historic infrastructure investment in the state, public transport and roads, just the transport side of it. You must be, as a planning professional, at least giving a tick in the box to the government that it is investing in significantly in public transport and in road infrastructure across the board.
Oh yes, that's right. But whether the car-based infrastructure should have been a big motorway like WestConnex, I think is problematic, because I don't think that the alternatives to WestConnex were perhaps investigated as they might have been. So just a brainwave in the infrastructure in New South Wales.
In isolation, I have some sympathy to that view. In isolation, if all we were doing is building WestConnex, I'd have a problem with that. I'm a big advocate of public transport and integrated transport, active transport. But there is a $50 billion investment in public transport infrastructure over the next 4 years. Historic.
I don't think that that's a negative at all. That's a very good thing. But I mean, I think I would point out that, I mean, in terms of spending money on motorways, it's not as if cities around the world don't spend money on motorways. It's the location in the inner city which is very problematic. Now, Australian cities are the only big cities in the Western world which are still building inner city motorways like WestConnex. If you look at a city like Toronto, which is very similar to Sydney, they stopped building inner city motorways some years ago. There are motorway routes in central Toronto which have been abandoned, where construction has stopped and so forth. And so the whole idea of inner city motorways is a peculiarly Australian phenomenon which is not being replicated across other advanced Western countries.
But WestConnex isn't delivering the traffic into George Street. In fact, we're pacifying George Street and trying to discourage private vehicle use in the city.
Light rail.
That's a very, reinventing cities for people is actually a noble objective. I spoke about Jan Geller in the Macquarie before, but in the 70s, rightly or wrongly, those roads to the CBD, into the CBD, were abandoned, and the corridor sold off. The technology is available today to tunnel, environmental and heritage benefits that delay caused, but there always was an intention to link up the city, like the north through to the west, the west through to the south. We've seen the benefits of M5 and M7 in terms of unexpected employment opportunities just boomed out there unexpectedly. So this is really a long-term economic vision for many governments, and now it's deliverable because of the state. Would you not see that that's part of an integrated plan for the state?
Well, as I say, other cities in other countries are not following this sort of path. If you look at Vancouver, San Francisco's got abandoned freeways, Toronto's got abandoned freeways. In London, there are enormous protests in the 60s and 70s against inner-city motorways, which stopped it. So I think there's a kind of roads mindset in Australia which sort of says that if you've got traffic congestion, you build your way out of it, and I think that's a mistake. And the evidence shows that if you build motorways and the traffic eventually builds up and you get back to the original levels of congestion quite quickly. I mean, in terms of George Street they're talking about, in fact, WestConnex, one of the aims is to get more traffic into the central area. I mean, that was one of the benefits. So that's a problem I do have with the WestConnex calculation. Well, into central Sydney, you've got nowhere to park there, you've got existing congestion, so I'm not sure that the traffic projections for WestConnex in terms of getting into the central area are viable.
So traffic volumes in the CBD are down quite dramatically.
The time is up for this session. We'll have to conclude it. So we thank you very much for your participation in our inquiry, Professor. All the best.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Go, Chair, once again.
We now have to go on to
Forum if it keeps up.
we now have a special session. And
No, we don't.
oh, you got Macquarie Court. Yeah, okay. I'm jumping the gun. It's Miss Mary. You to state your name and position title and swear either an oath or affirmation. The words should be on the card in front of you.
Yes, my name is Mary Court and I'm the Secretary of Penrith Valley Community Unions, which is a group made up of retired unionists mainly. And I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Now, for your information, if there's any questions that you can't answer, they can be taken on notice and you have 21 days to answer the question.
Thank you.
Do you wish to make an opening statement?
Yes, please.
If you could proceed, thank you.
I come before you today on behalf of the workers and their families of Western Sydney. The M4 toll on motorists may have already started, but Western Sydney will continue to rise up and roar with purpose and passion with a clear message to this government. WestConnex and tolls are a vote-changing issue for communities right across the state. Premier Gladys is presiding over a total frenzy of private toll road building that is sucking billions out of public transport for generations to come. We, the people of Western Sydney, will continue to rise up and stand in solidarity and defiance about the continued destruction of communities by WestConnex and the burden of the huge toll tax being inflicted on families for decades to come. Western Sydney is a vibrant community for hundreds of thousands of people. It is not a dumping ground for Sydney's problems. The M4 toll is just another tax being inflicted on Western Sydney for the next 42 years, a toll that is set to increase at twice the rate of inflation. For most residents, this massive toll tax is an assault on their standard of living and will have a long-term chronic effect on household stress, especially when the toll is going up 4% a year. Shame on the Minister of WestConnex for putting this new toll tax on his own electorate, especially after former Premier Barry O'Farrell promised in 2010 that a Liberal government would not put any new tolls on an existing road. Commuters across Western Sydney must now pay more than $2,000 extra a year in tolls to travel on the M4 each day to get to work. And for what? An extra lane for a 7.5 kilometre trip between Parramatta and Homebush? That road upgrade will only take 2 years of tolls to pay off. So why are Western Sydney and regional New South Wales being exploited to pay this massive toll tax for the next 42 years? This is unfair and unaffordable for families struggling to put food on the table. The M4 toll is highway robbery. Western Sydney tradespeople who need their tools to do their work are severely disadvantaged by the cost of these tolls. All goods and services from the city would have the toll costs included. The cost of living in Sydney is out of control and leaving people on the edge. Family budgets are already under pressure from soaring electricity bills, stagnant wage growth, insecure work, cuts to penalty rates, record rents and over-the-top house prices. And the added burden of the toll is just too much. One toll leads to another toll and another in this, the largest toll city in the world, where Sydney will have more road tolls than any other city by 2023. Enough is enough. We need to get the high volume of cars off the roads, and one of the answers is fast, efficient, cheap public transport, including more trains and more express services. The Australia we once knew, which our parents experienced, is not the reality anymore, because the rules that made our country fair are broken. We need to bring fairness back to Australia. Inequality is at a 70-year high. Wage growth is the lowest it's ever been, but profits are up. 40% of Australians now has insecure work. Youth unemployment is in double digits, and the richest 1% of Australians owns more wealth than the bottom 70% of Australians combined. Stop pillaging our communities. We are talking about billions of dollars to be paid in tolls over decades to national and international interests. There needs to be proper scrutiny and urgent reform of why this is so. If this government thinks it can keep dumping on people and get away with it without a fight, then I repeat the message coming out of Western Sydney today. Don't mess with the West. The WestConnex and M4 toll are vote changers. For the past 18 months, the Penrith Valley Community Unions has had a stall at Penrith Paceway markets as well as around Penrith's main street, gathering signatures to a letter addressed to local MP Stuart Ayres, who is also the Minister for WestConnex. So far, we have delivered 2 lots of 2,000 letters to Stuart Ayres' office, and we're about to deliver another 2,000 letters in protest about the M4 toll. You can see all the photos of people signing the letter on our Facebook page. In fact, I can categorically say with utmost confidence from our poll on the ground that after having thousands of conversations with the public these past couple of years, there is going to be a huge swing in Penrith for the next state election because of one of the things being the M4 toll. People are hurting out there, and we are hearing the same story over and over again, that it's more difficult for many people to earn a living wage to provide for their families. It's barely covering the bills and groceries, let alone the M4 toll. For some people, it's now taking longer to get to work because to avoid the toll, they are diverting off the M4 along the Parramatta Road, making that even more congested. A young woman told me only last week she has to fluctuate her travel to get to work because of the toll, and whenever she takes Parramatta Road, she has to leave home 3 hours early. On closing, the one question which people have asked me to bring to this committee today is, will there be a toll from Penrith to the city where the construction works are currently underway on the northern road leading onto the M4? Thank you for hearing me today.
Thank you. Yes. Commence. I know you want to participate when you're in the audience, but you're not allowed to participate in the inquiry other than to observe what is being said and what is being done. So we have
Thank
to move
you,
on.
Reverend. And Ms. Cott, you act as a volunteer as the Secretary of Penrith Valley Community Union, is that correct?
That's correct.
Well, thank you for the work that you do in your voluntary capacity.
Thank you.
As well. Ms. Cott, the member for Penrith, who's also the Minister for WestConnex, says that actually the people of Western Sydney are very happy to pay this toll. Is that true?
Well, not from what I'm hearing at the markets and around Penrith, no.
How happy are they?
People are very unhappy. So this is what we're hearing every fortnight. We're out there having conversations, and we have been out there since before it even came. As soon as we heard there was an M4 toll coming onto the freeway last year, early last year, we were out there with the community, and we have been out there ever since. So we're hearing that, no, it's affecting people in their pocket. Okay, it's just an extra. It's extra. They cannot afford, on top of everything going up. The cost of living's going up, but wages are stagnant. They can't keep up with it all, and it's just another thing. But people are angry too because we were promised by Barry O'Farrell that there would be no more toll on the M4 after we paid it off. So
Ms. Cott, have you ever been advised that every dollar spent on widening the M4 will be recovered by tolls next year?
we have been told that is 42 years that toll's going to be there, and people object to paying for the next 42 years for that 7.5 kilometre strip when it's only going to pay 2 years of tolls.
In a tolling inquiry last year, we were told by RMS that the reason why that toll has to last for 60 years is to pay for stage 3 of the WestConnex, which is the least trafficked part of WestConnex. RMS say that 169,000 people will use the first stage, but only 33,000 people will use the third stage, 3A. They say that it's appropriate for the people of Western Sydney to effectively subsidise the construction of stage 3 because there's a network effect. Do you think it's fair and reasonable that the first stage cross-subsidises the third stage, and therefore the people who of Penrith have to pay for the use of the service in the city's east?
Absolutely not. Why should they be paying for the next 42 years for an area that's not even on the M4? So why is Western Sydney paying for the rest of the state?
So for a person who's driving, say, from Parramatta to Strathfield to get to, for example, the RPA, because they're working as a nurse, for example, who would never use stage 3, do you think it's fair that that person is helping subsidise the least traffic and least commercial part of the WestConnex project?
I'm only talking about M4 from the people coming from Western Sydney. I do not know how people travel from in a city. I've always been out in the west.
Ms. Court, are you aware that you say that the toll goes up by 4% or CPI, which is greater every year? Are you actually aware that that happens every 3 months, not every year?
That's right.
And are you aware that
3 months?
Forward projections...
Shameful. How dare they put that on the people of Western Sydney every 3 months? How much is that going to be in 43 years? How much will that toll be?
It's about $27 to be... Actually, if you were to compound it...
After 43 years, going up 4%.
Actually, I think it's $27 in like 2033, but you can see my point.
That's right, that's shameful.
Have you ever received...
$27 one way.
Has a member for Penrith or the Minister for WestConnex ever explained to you or your group or to anyone? Just
he's ignored us.
But has he ever explained why it's necessary for this toll to rise by a minimum of 4% every quarter when, for example, Eastern District or other ones are going up by CPI? The Queensland toll roads all go up by CPI. Have you ever been explained or told why it's necessary for the toll?
No, he hasn't spoken to any of us.
No. And you say that a person who uses a toll every day, every day would spend approximately $2,000 per year on toll.
Oh, more than 2,000.
To the extent to which the government says that that cost is ameliorated by that toll relief program that they promised, do you think that's effective relief for the people of Western Sydney?
No, it's not, because if they're going to get it back at tax time...
Or off the registration?
Well, why isn't the registration paying for roads and tolls like they're supposed to be?
So the government says that if you spend $1,500 a year on tolls, you're entitled to get some relief on your registration. Some people have said that that's actually far more about ensuring that the traffic volume projections are met that we've now warranted as we've sold it, than it is necessarily about providing registration relief. Do you agree with that?
What I have heard is that with the new airport coming out, there are going to be more tankers on the road. In fact, 6 tankers are going to fill one plane. So how many more hundreds of tankers are going to be on the road?
We'll move on to the Greens.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for appearing today, Mary, and all the work you do advocating for people in Western Sydney. I think actually you're probably the only witness we may have who can talk about the impact of the M4 tolls and what this means for the people of Western Sydney. So today we've heard a lot about from residents in terms of the impacts that the construction of WestConnex is having, particularly around the inner west, but I believe you may be here almost as the sole representative to talk to us today about the impact it's having with people. So,
I totally agree with all the concerns for people from the inner city. You know, when you've got from the St Peters and Haberfield and the Rozelle, we've been supporting them because of all the destruction that's been happening in the inner city. But for Western Sydney, it's mainly that toll.
Yes, absolutely. So Could you provide the committee one or two examples of families or people who are doing it tough and who may have been talking to you, because you've got the No M4 Tolls group, about the impact of those tolls on their daily lives? Give us some stories.
Well, I've been speaking to a lot of the wives while their husbands are out of work, and they're telling us how it's been impacting on their household budget because their husbands that work around the state, they're going through all these different tolls. So each week it can be over $100 each week, just extra in paying the tolls for their husbands to go to work. On Saturdays when we've been out in the community, we have our signs up. We don't even have to call people or let people come over. They see our signs and they go, where do we sign? We're sick to death of this. All this government's got to go. Everything's going through the roof. That toll is rubbish when we were promised that there'd be no more tolls. So it's the promises. People are sick to death of all the lies that we keep hearing. So that compounded, the tolls compounding with every other thing in their budget, going up, and the main thrust that's coming through is there's people are hurting out there. They can't afford more and more and more that's coming down on them. Okay, so that toll, that's just the end of it, and the fact that it's going up 4% every 3 months.
That's extraordinary. So you're hearing from people
every fortnight. Every fortnight we are out there.
$100 a week.
Over.
They're paying in tolls, families.
Yes, when the husband's out there has to go to different areas of the state for his job.
What are they
tradespeople?
What are they talking to you about in terms of using WestConnex on top of the extraordinary amount of tolls the people of Western Sydney are already paying? What's their feedback to you about spending even more on WestConnex tolls?
That's right. People are angry. People are angry and they do not want to. And a lot of them say that if they can find a way of not going on that WestConnex, they will do it. Right. But the thing is, when they bypass it, everywhere they go, it's put too much congestion on the rest of the road. So as some of them say, some days when they're running late, then they'll do the toll. But they're keeping off that road as much as they can, but it's costing too much.
People who have more money can afford to pay the tolls and they can save their time, but those who don't?
Yes, families. There's a lot of pressure on families. So that toll, and what they see is, it's just big business when it should have been put on public transport.
Thank you.
Now, I'm assuming that there are always and would be people out at Penrith looking for jobs.
Yes.
The government has promised that under the WestConnect there will be 10,000 new jobs provided during construction, direct and indirect. Do you see that as one of the advantages of the WestConnect in providing jobs?
Not really, because we believe that they're inflated. There's a lot of labour hire out there. So with the jobs, then there's specialist jobs as well. So out of Western Sydney, we can't see that there's those figures that have been projected.
You question them?
Yes.
Yeah. Also, as you've probably heard, by having underground motorway, which is what the WestConnect will be, it returns local streets to local communities. It makes it more
after they've
livable.
Destroyed all the local communities.
Also, another plus from the WestConnect is that there'll be 18 hectares of open space for local communities. Those are the figures provided by the government.
How can that be when they're taking, by putting the WestConnex, they're impinging on properties? So how can they be adding to it?
So even though we can't avoid the tolls, apparently.
Well, why not?
But the WestConnect.
Why not? Why is it the big business are getting all those tolls? That's why people are going to rise up through this. And we're here, and as I said, I can speak with authority because we're listening to it for the last 18 months every fortnight.
Well, one of the advantages, I imagine, of the toll, and I'm only quoting the government's response to our questions.
Well, there you go.
The drivers will avoid going through 52 sets of traffic signals. Do you see that as an advantage? Is that worth?
But it's the expense, Mr. Chairman. It's the expense on the families, on the residents. You know, that's what they're looking at, what's hitting them in the pocket. and there's more and more expense out there, but their wages are still the same.
The other advantage of the WestConnex was it meant that the government did not have to resume as much land acquisitions as they would have if it was above land, because it's a tunnel.
Well, I believe they should have looked at more public transport. That would have been the answer. Quick public transport. I mean, even coming on the train in here today, I feel sorry for the people coming on the trains because after you get past Penrith, you can hardly get on. People were pushing on. I said, this is why don't they invest all those billions into public transport instead of sending the money overseas to all these big business?
We'll move on to the government.
Public transport is the way.
Good.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for coming in, Ms Court. Ms Court, a paediatric nurse who travels from Penrith to Westmead Children's Hospital, how much toll will she pay?
$4 something.
Well, no.
I don't know because I haven't spoken to a nurse who has driven.
What about a police senior constable who travels
Take the
from...
question on notice if you don't know the exact answer.
Oh, okay.
From Emu Plains to the police
And you can get us
department
the answer.
headquarters in
hold on,
Parramatta.
here we are. I've got it here. It's all in this.
Okay.
Can I just pass you this here and you can get all the answers from
A
that?
police senior constable who travels from Emu Plains to the police department headquarters in Parramatta, how much toll would he pay?
There we are. It's on that docket.
So you don't know. What about a fireman who travels from...
Order. The witness has offered to hand up a schedule which contains the full set of tolls that I think the member's directing the questions to. So,
What about a fireman who travels in from Glenmore Park to Maryland's Fire and Rescue?
point of order.
I'm not here on...
Okay, would it be true to say that they pay zero toll?
Phelps.
Each of those three people
Dr.
pays zero
Phelps, a
toll.
point of order has been taken by Mr. Donnelly.
My point of order is that the witness has handed up a schedule of what the tolls are. So that's,
Okay,
I understand
I'll
the answer
stop
she's
that.
provided.
Thank you.
Would you be surprised to find that each of those three scenarios, the person pays no toll whatsoever?
Well, good on them.
Okay, thanks very much.
Yes.
Are you a supporter of Labor's proposed cashback scheme on the M4?
Well, that's more than what we're getting from Liberal.
So is that a yes? You do support Mr Foley's proposal?
Well, if they're going to give a cashback, well, that's something coming back to the people.
Okay, what would be the cost of that to taxpayers?
200 mil.
You know the answer. Why are you asking me?
So you support a scheme which you have no knowledge of what the costing is?
Well, you've just told... All I've heard is there's going to be a cashback. That's it.
Well, you've indicated that you support Labor's cashback scheme.
Well, look,
And
with a Labor, Liberal, whoever, if there was a cashback, it doesn't matter to me who is bringing it in. We're just looking at how much people are going to get back. Just like those tolls and roads are supposed to be coming out of registration. So what's happening to all the rego money? That's a question people are asking us. Where's our registration?
Would you be aware
have the cashback? Yes.
that the Shadow Treasurer has costed the M4 cashback proposal at $200 million or over per year over the forward estimates?
Not over. 200
per year.
Is that $200 million a year? Are you aware that the Labor Shadow Treasurer has costed a cashback proposal at $200 million a year or over the next 4 years per year?
Well, I tell you what, they can take it out of the billions that they were going to put into the stadiums. So don't give me that.
Well, okay.
The stadiums, they were going to spend billions on the stadiums, and now you're telling me they can't afford millions on cashback.
Okay, do you understand the difference between capital expenditure and recurrent expenditure?
Point of order, Chair. Point of order.
That's right. I'm just a resident here telling you from what the people...
Ms Court is here representing the residents of Western Sydney.
That's right.
And I think the questions that Dr Peter Phelps is asking are actually verging on bullying.
Yes.
The Honourable...
Just ask the
respect,
witness
You don't
questions
fall well.
that's within her capability of answering.
Okay. Capital expenditure costs are a one-off occurrence. Recurrent expenditures recur over year after year after year. Are you
patronising,
Are you prepared for taxpayers to pay, at a minimum, $200 million every year to these big businesses for a cashback scheme?
I don't even want to answer you because I don't like your attitude.
Correct.
Okay. Do you believe that if a cashback scheme were brought in, more people would use the M4?
Well, if if the M4, yes, I think people would if they were getting some of their money back.
Okay.
Because
So-
that's been the
Point of
whole
order,
thing.
Chair. Point of order. Can I just, with the next question that Dr. Phelps asked, could he just ask it with respect to the witness who has turned up?
Okay. If there was to be an increase, what do you believe the increase would be in the traffic on the M4?
Point of order, Mr Chair.
Well, you've already done that. Well,
Point of order, Mr Chair. Sorry, Ms Scott. We just took a point of order about the witness's capacity to actually answer. Like, that question that Dr Phelps posed, it's actually one of the most complicated questions you could ask a traffic forecaster.
RMS was here this morning.
RMS was here this morning. These questions could have been directed to the witnesses who actually have got that expertise. It's unfair for Ms Court to have to provide her views as to traffic modelling on a question that complicated.
So you believe in something which you don't know, you
Point of
haven't
order,
costed,
Chair. Point of order.
and you have no idea what the
Point
implications
of
would be if it were
order.
introduced.
Point of
Is-
order. Point of order.
The witness is not building it. Is not building it. She just wants to get a fair deal.
It's because she did so well.
Yes, well, that's not my area. I'm here
We
for the
understand that.
families.
We understand that.
Thank you.
Terry, thank you for
Thank
We're
coming.
here for facts, not feelings.
Thank you. Oh, my.
Oh, well.
Order,
The facts are you'll be gone at the next election because of the M4 toll.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Being a very forthright witness. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we might have some questions on notice.
I think Dr Phelps might have a few.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.